Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Unseen Watchers of Westview Manor. The call came in at precisely 3:17 a.m. Detective Isabella "Izzy" Diaz had been working the night shift at the precinct for 3 years, and in that time, I'd learned to expect the unexpected. But this was different. The caller ID displayed private number. The voice on the other end was a man's, strained and breathless, laced with a terror that sent a shiver down my spine. "Help me," he gasped, his words punctuated by ragged breaths. They're watching me. I can feel them." "Sir," I said, my voice calm and professional, despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. "This is 911. Can you tell me your name and location?" Michael Thorne," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Westview Manor, apartment 3B. Please hurry." Westview Manor. I knew the place. An old, sprawling apartment complex on the edge of town, with a reputation for being unsettled. There had been rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, and a general feeling of unease among the residents. But nothing concrete, nothing that had ever warranted a full investigation. "What's happening, Mr. Thorne?" I asked, my fingers flying across the keyboard, entering the information into the dispatch system. "Who's watching you?" I don't know," he whispered. "I can't see them, but I can feel them. They're everywhere. In the walls, in the shadows, watching." His voice was growing weaker, more frantic. I could hear a faint scratching sound in the background, like fingernails on wood. "Are you alone, Mr. Thorne?" I asked. "Yes," he whispered. I locked myself in the bedroom, but they're trying to get in. I can hear them scratching at the door." I dispatched 2 patrol cars to his location, giving them the address and the nature of the call. Possible home invasion. Caller reports unseen intruders. I stayed on the line with Michael, trying to keep him calm, trying to get more information. But his responses were becoming increasingly incoherent. His words slurred, his breathing shallow. They're in the room now," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can see them in the mirror." The mirror? What did that mean? Then a scream, a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that cut through the phone line, making me jump in my seat. Silence. The line went dead. I tried to call back, but the number was unreachable. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, the scream echoing in my ears. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that something terrible had happened in apartment 3B. The patrol cars arrived at Westview Manor within minutes. Officers Reynolds and Cole, 2 veterans I knew and trusted, were the first on the scene. I listened to their radio traffic, my hands clenched tightly, my breath held captive in my chest. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We're at the location. Apartment 3B. Door is unlocked." Pause. Then, Officer Reynolds' voice, strained and hesitant. "Dispatch, we have a situation here. The apartment, it's ransacked. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, belongings scattered everywhere. But no sign of forced entry." "Any sign of the caller? Unit 4? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Another pause, longer this time. "Negative, dispatch," Reynolds replied. "The apartment is empty, except for what, Unit 4? I pressed, my heart sinking. "Except for the cameras," Reynolds said. "There are cameras everywhere, dozens of them, all pointed at the bed." Cameras? Dozens of them, pointed at the bed? What was going on? "And dispatch," Reynolds continued, his voice now barely a whisper. There's something else. On the bedroom mirror. Writing. In what looks like blood." My blood ran cold. "What does it say, Unit 4? A long, agonizing silence. Then, Reynolds' voice, filled with a chilling dread. It says, "They're always watching. They're always watching." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, a terrifying echo of Michael Thorne's last, desperate plea. I knew with a certainty that defied logic that this wasn't a simple home invasion. This was something else, something far more sinister, something that involved unseen watchers, ransacked apartments, dozens of cameras, and messages written in blood. I had to investigate. I had to find out what had happened to Michael Thorne, and I had to uncover the truth behind the chilling message on the mirror. I requested to be assigned to the case, despite the fact that it was technically a patrol matter, not a detective-level investigation. My supervisor, Captain Hayes, a gruff but fair man who had seen his share of strange cases, reluctantly agreed, knowing my persistence and my intuition. I arrived at Westview Manor, the scene already swarming with uniformed officers, forensic technicians, and crime scene investigators. The apartment complex was old, a sprawling, three-story building with faded paint, cracked walkways, and a general air of neglect. Apartment 3B was on the second floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The door was open, yellow crime scene tape crisscrossing the entrance. I stepped inside, the air immediately feeling colder, heavier than the hallway. The apartment was a mess, a chaotic jumble of overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and ripped open drawers. It looked like a hurricane had swept through, leaving behind only destruction and disorder. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange order. The cameras, dozens of them mounted on the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, all pointed towards the center of the room, towards the empty bed. They were a mix of different models, different sizes, different brands, as if they had been collected over time, added one by one, in a growing, obsessive frenzy. I approached the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror was large, covering almost the entire wall opposite the bed, and on it, scrawled in what had been confirmed as human blood, were the words, "They're always watching." I stared at the message, my mind reeling. Who were they? And what had they done to Michael Thorne? The forensic technicians were busy collecting evidence, dusting for fingerprints, photographing the scene, searching for any clue that could shed light on what had happened. But I knew, deep down, that they wouldn't find anything. Not anything conventional. This wasn't a crime that could be solved with forensics, with fingerprints, with DNA evidence. This was something else. Something that defied logic, that defied explanation. Something that was connected to the unseen watchers, to the cameras, to the message on the mirror. I started interviewing the residents of Westview Manor, hoping to find someone who had seen or heard something, anything that could help me understand what was going on. I learned that Michael Thorne had been a recluse, a loner who kept to himself. He had lived in the apartment for about 6 months, and no one knew much about him. He rarely spoke to his neighbors, rarely left his apartment, and always seemed nervous, paranoid. I also learned that apartment 3B had a history of strange occurrences. Previous tenants had reported unexplained noises, flickering lights, objects moving on their own, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Several had moved out abruptly, without explanation, leaving behind their belongings. One tenant had even claimed to see shadows moving in the corners of her eyes, figures that disappeared as soon as she looked directly at them. The building manager, a weary-looking man named Mr. Davies, dismissed the stories as overactive imaginations and hallucinations. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the unspoken acknowledgement that something wasn't right with apartment 3B. I obtained the security footage from the cameras mounted in the hallways of Westview Manor. I spent hours reviewing the tapes, watching the comings and goings of the residents, searching for any sign of Michael Thorne, for any clue that could explain his disappearance. I saw him on the footage several times. He always looked nervous, agitated, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if he expected to be followed. He always wore a heavy coat, even indoors, and he always carried a large, bulky backpack. But I never saw anyone enter or leave his apartment with him. He was always alone. Then, I noticed something strange. On the night of his disappearance, the footage from the hallway camera outside his apartment glitched. For a few seconds, the image became distorted, blurry, filled with static. Then it returned to normal. But Michael Thorne was gone. He had been standing in the hallway, looking directly at the camera, his expression filled with terror. Then the glitch, and then nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I rewound the footage, playing it again and again, zooming in, enhancing the image, searching for any explanation. There was none. The glitch, the static, the disappearance. It was all connected. I was sure of it. Connected to the cameras in his apartment, to the message on the mirror, to the unseen watchers. I needed to find out what was causing the glitches, what was distorting the footage, what was hiding in the static. I contacted a friend of mine, a tech specialist named Alex, who worked for a local surveillance company. I showed him the footage, explained the situation, asked for his help. He examined the tapes carefully, running them through various filters, analyzing the distortions, searching for any patterns, any anomalies. "This isn't normal static, is he?" He said, his voice serious. "This is something else, something structured, like a signal." "A signal? What kind of signal? And what was it transmitting? Can you isolate it?" I asked. "Can you clean it up?" Alex nodded. "I can try," he said, "but it's going to take some time. This is complex." He spent the next few days working on the footage using specialized software, advanced algorithms, and a healthy dose of his own expertise. Finally, he called me. "I've got something, Izzy," he said, his voice excited. "You need to see this." I went to Alex's office, a small, cluttered space filled with computers, monitors, and electronic equipment. He led me to his workstation, where the footage from the hallway camera was playing on a large screen. "I managed to isolate the signal," he explained, pointing to the screen. "And I enhanced it. It's embedded in the static, hidden within the distortion." He pressed a button, and the image on the screen changed. The blurry, static-filled footage was replaced by something else. A face, or rather, faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all crammed together, their features distorted, blurred, almost melted. They were pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their expressions a mixture of terror and hunger. They were the unseen watchers. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, mesmerized, horrified, unable to tear my eyes away. What are they?" I whispered. Alex shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know," he said, "but they're not human. They're something else. Something that's using the cameras, the surveillance systems as a gateway, a way to observe, a way to feed." "Feed? On what?" Then I understood. The cameras in Michael Thorne's apartment. They weren't just recording. They were transmitting him to the unseen watchers. He had been feeding them with his fear, his paranoia, his life force, and then they had taken him. "The message on the mirror," I said, my voice trembling. "They're always watching." It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. Alex nodded slowly. "They're always watching, Izzy," he said. "Through our cameras, through our phones, through our screens. They're always there, just beyond our perception, waiting for what? To feed? To take? To consume?" I knew I had to do something. I had to stop them. I had to find a way to close the gateway. But how? I looked at the screen again, at the faces of the unseen watchers, their hollow eyes staring back at me, their gaping mouths whispering silent, unintelligible words. And then I noticed something else. A symbol, a faint, almost imperceptible symbol, etched into the forehead of each of the faces. It was the same symbol I had seen on the muddy footprints at Blackwood, the same symbol on the mirror at Morgan's Creek, and the same symbol on the door in the construction trailer. The symbol of protection, of containment. But here it was inverted, reversed, corrupted. The inverted symbol. It was a key, I realized. a key to understanding the unseen watchers, to understanding their connection to the other cases, to the other manifestations. It was a sign of corruption, of a protective barrier being breached, of a containment field being inverted. The cameras, the screens, the technology, they weren't just gateways. They were amplifiers. They were strengthening the connection between our world and theirs. They were allowing the unseen watchers to feed. And Michael Thorne, with his obsessive surveillance, his paranoia, his fear, he had been the perfect conduit, the perfect meal. I knew what I had to do. I had to destroy the cameras. I had to break the connection. I had to starve the watchers. I went back to Westview Manor, armed with a sledgehammer and a determination born of desperation and a growing sense of righteous anger. I found the maintenance closet, the central hub for the building's security system. I smashed the lock, entered the room, and began to destroy the equipment. I smashed the monitors, ripped out the cables, pulverized the hard drives, reducing the sophisticated surveillance system to a pile of shattered plastic, twisted metal, and broken glass. Then I went to apartment 3B. The door was still open, the yellow crime scene tape still in place. I stepped inside, the air still heavy with that cold, metallic scent. I went to the bedroom, to the mirror. The message, "They're always watching," was still there, scrawled in dried blood. I raised the sledgehammer and, with all my strength, smashed the mirror. The glass shattered, raining down on the floor in a cascade of glittering shards. The message was gone. Then I turned my attention to the cameras. One by one, I ripped them from the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, smashing them to pieces with the sledgehammer, reducing them to nothing but twisted metal and broken circuits. As I destroyed each camera, I felt a release, a lessening of the pressure, of the feeling of being watched, of the wrongness that had permeated the apartment. When I was finished, the room was a scene of utter devastation. But it was also clean, empty. The unseen watchers were gone. I left the apartment, leaving the door open, letting the air circulate, letting the reality return. I walked out of Westview Manor, into the night, the sledgehammer still in my hand. I didn't look back. The apartment stayed empty. No one ever moved back. I kept my job, my boss putting my actions down to stress, and ordering a psych eval. It was a small price. I knew the unseen watchers were still out there, lurking in the shadows, in the between spaces, waiting for another opportunity, another gateway, another meal. But I had learned something. I had learned that they could be fought, that they could be starved, and I would be ready. I would keep watching. I would keep listening, and I would keep fighting, because the darkness is always there, but so is the light. And sometimes all it takes is a single act of defiance, a single act of destruction, to break the connection, to silence the whispers, to starve the watchers. But they would be back, somewhere, sometime. They always were. And I, along with the others, would be ready. The buried secret of Oak Haven Farm. It was October 7th, 2021, a date etched in my mind like the grooves on an old vinyl record, when I first put these words to paper. But the story itself takes us back over 2 decades, to the fading twilight of 1999. The world was a different place then. Cell phones were bulky, impractical, and certainly not ubiquitous. The impending doom of Y2K loomed large in the collective consciousness. Midnight, December 31st, was a date circled in red on everyone's mental calendar. I, Elias Thorne, was a 16-year-old, teetering on the cusp of adulthood, and what I witnessed one frigid October night remains as vivid today as it was then. To understand the full weight of what happened, you need to picture the setting. My childhood home was a solitary sentinel, perched atop a lonely hill in the remote Midwestern countryside. Imagine a vast expanse of farmland stretching out in 3 directions, a seemingly endless canvas of wheat, corn, or whatever crop rotated through that season. Beyond the fields, dense, forbidding woods took over, the kind of woods that whispered secrets and held shadows you wouldn't dare explore after sunset. The only artery connecting us to the outside world was a 2-lane ribbon of asphalt, County Road 577, A desolate stretch where the passage of a car at night was more unsettling than reassuring. Then, a miracle, or so it seemed at the time, the internet. Our family already owned a computer, a hulking beige box that probably sat in the corner for a year or two before, the symbol of a future my parents, bless their hearts, could only dimly perceive. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but they instinctively understood the pivotal role a PC would play in the lives of my brothers, Ethan and Caleb, and me. They rarely touched the machine themselves, but for us, it was a gateway to another dimension. I believe it was a Dell or maybe a Gateway, the titans of that era. Windows 95 was our operating system. It's hard to convey the sheer novelty of owning a computer. The internet was still a nascent concept, a distant whisper for ordinary folks like us. We were content more than content, lost in the simple pleasures of PC games, typing out rambling, nonsensical stories, and creating vibrant, pixelated masterpieces in MS Paint. If you were fortunate enough to own a printer, you could produce those colossal banners, each letter sprawling across an entire page, adorned with cheesy clip art and whimsical fonts. I recall crafting a Go Broncos banner, a testament to my fervent support for their Super Bowl aspirations. 7 letters, 7 pages, and a drained ink cartridge, a testament to a simpler, yet resource-intensive time. I apologize for the digression. The late 90s hold a special place in my memory. My point is this: that period, the era of souped-up PCs, was transformative. These weren't the clunky, single-program machines of the 80s. They were intuitive, versatile, and capable of so much more. But the internet was a paradigm shift, a tectonic upheaval that redefined everything. Understatement of the century doesn't even begin to cover it. What's also fascinating, looking back, is how we navigated the digital landscape without the refined, polished search engines we take for granted today. Googling wasn't a verb. You couldn't simply type sports into Yahoo and expect a deluge of relevant results. The search engines that did exist were rudimentary, clunky, and finding anything specific felt like searching for a needle in a digital haystack. The experience was a far cry from the seamless ease we enjoy in the present. My father, a man of quiet ingenuity, reconfigured our entire living room around the computer. He built a custom desk, a masterpiece of practicality with ample shelving and perfectly sized cutouts for the monitor, a sliding drawer for the keyboard, and all the necessary peripherals. He even installed a sliding glass door near the computer, a seemingly innocuous addition that would later become a source of profound unease. It allowed us to enjoy the sprawling outdoor vista while immersed in early point-and-click adventures, and provided convenient access for, shall we say, nature's calls. Our nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and with 4 boys in the house, well, let's just say the outdoors served a dual purpose. Our initial foray into the online world was an exercise in frustration. The sole internet provider in our area was just as green as we were, navigating uncharted waters. We sat, ears glued to the speaker, listening to that now iconic dial-up modem symphony of beeps and screeches, praying for a connection, a glimpse into the digital ether. Weeks passed, filled with failed attempts. We had no idea what we were missing, not like today when an internet outage sends us into a state of digital withdrawal. But once we connected, once that magical connection was established, the rest, as they say, is history. There I was, a restless teenager, burning the midnight oil, surfing the web, a term that sounds almost quaint now, stumbling upon websites, accessing information from across the globe, all from the confines of our isolated farmhouse. Back then, you might catch a commercial on Saturday morning television, urging you to join them on the World Wide Web, followed by a painstakingly recited URL. Finding anything required precision. You needed the exact address. A sports show might direct you to the Sports Illustrated for Kids website, spelling out the lengthy URL. Today, you'd simply Google SI Kids and find it in a fraction of a second. Being connected felt liberating, empowering. Our physical surroundings were vast, unforgiving, and, frankly, lonely. The unsettling truth, the unspoken reality, was that it was also inherently creepy. No streetlights illuminated the darkness after sunset. The long, winding county roads were deserted at night. Whenever a car did venture up our road, I'd freeze in my room, my heart pounding in my chest. The slow creep of headlights across the stairwell window was a source of intense anxiety. No one should be on that road so late, perhaps besides the occasional long-haul trucker. But even then, our location was far removed from any major city or freeway. There was no logical reason for commercial vehicles to be in our vicinity. You're probably wondering where all this rambling is leading, what this protracted preamble has to do with anything. I assure you it's all connected. The advent of the internet in my young life ignited a renewed fascination with scary stories, horror movies, and the macabre. I already devoured horror flicks from the local video store, a 20-minute drive away whenever I could. I borrowed spine-chilling books from the library. My friends and I concocted our own urban legends, fueled by youthful imaginations and a healthy dose of fear. Now, I had access to a boundless repository of horror movie lore, serial killer profiles, and anything my teenage mind could conjure. Being in such a secluded, isolated location didn't exactly alleviate my anxieties about the surrounding darkness. Sitting at that computer, with the expansive sliding glass door to my right, I saw nothing but an inky black void. We hadn't yet installed curtains, a seemingly minor detail that amplified the sense of vulnerability. One night, around 1 a.m., I saw something that has haunted me, to varying degrees, ever since. I can't explain it rationally, and it still fills me with a primal dread. I was online, alone. Everyone else was sound asleep. I was probably engrossed in a flash game or poring over sports statistics. Then, I heard it. The low, guttural rumble of an approaching vehicle. It instantly put me on high alert. As I mentioned, I could sense the vehicle's approach long before it reached our house, and I always hoped it would pass by without incident. This time, there was an incident. A small, red pickup truck, possibly a Ford Ranger, skidded off the road, perhaps 100 yards or so from our house. I was looking at the rear of the vehicle. Instinctively, I switched off the living room light and the computer monitor. I knew with a chilling certainty that this was not going to be good. I huddled close to the window, trying to conceal myself as much as possible. Realistically, I doubt anyone could have seen me from that distance, but I could see them. Two men burst out of the truck. The driver was a burly figure, clad in a plaid long-sleeve shirt and a puffy vest, the quintessential image of a northern hillbilly. He moved with a surprising agility to the passenger side, yanking the door open with a force that could have ripped it off its hinges. He hauled a smaller man out of the truck by his collar, tossing him unceremoniously to the ground. My heart was now a frantic drum against my ribs. The passenger was clearly the subordinate in this unsettling duo. The driver threw open the tailgate and grabbed a shovel, tossing it to the passenger. The shovel clattered to the ground, hitting the smaller man's hands. He looked terrified, utterly helpless. The driver then retrieved what appeared to be a burlap sack from the truck bed. He tossed it forcefully to the passenger, but this time the smaller man caught it. Even from my vantage point, I could discern the look on the inferior man's face. His eyes were wide with terror, his face likely streaked with tears and snot. His expression screamed, "Please don't do this." He pleaded with exaggerated hand gestures, a silent, desperate plea. He seemed to beg for an extended period, conveying the message, "Please don't make me do this." The burly man pointed to the ground. I couldn't decipher his words, but the meaning was clear. Dig. The passenger, with visible reluctance, began to dig. After 5 to 10 minutes, an eternity in that tense silence, the burly man stopped his partner. He pointed to the burlap sack now resting on the ground, then pointed to the freshly dug hole. The defeated digger, with a final, despairing kick, sent the sack tumbling into the earth. The sack, it looked like it could contain a bowling ball or a human head. That was the only thought that raced through my mind. I was witnessing someone bury a human head on our property. The man with the shovel proceeded to bury the head, or sack, refilling the hole with the excavated dirt. The driver then shoved the smaller man back into the truck, threw the shovel in the back, and sped off into the night. After what felt like an eon, I finally exhaled, realizing I'd probably been holding my breath throughout the entire harrowing ordeal. Gasping for air, I sprinted upstairs to my room, drenched in a cold sweat. I hadn't even realized the depth of my terror until that moment. Did they see me? Why did they choose to stop there, near one of the only houses for miles? I desperately hoped I was overreacting, but what else could those men possibly be burying at that hour in that remote location? I remember it being cold, probably not the dead of winter because the ground would have been frozen solid, but it was certainly an unpleasant night. What drove these men out here? I didn't want to know. I've only shared this story with a handful of people, and they all invariably asked the same question. Did you go out and see what it was the next day? The answer is a resounding, emphatic hell no. I didn't possess the courage, the morbid curiosity, to investigate. That curiosity, however, has lingered, a persistent, unsettling itch. I couldn't definitively identify those men. Nothing remotely similar ever happened before or after. I won't resort to cliches like, "It haunts me every single day," but it does occupy my thoughts frequently. The most disturbing element, the detail that truly chills me to the bone, is what I discovered a few days later. I found a dirt-covered shovel in our barn, a small amount of what appeared to be dried blood staining the tip. My father, Richard Thorne, had always strictly forbidden us from entering the barn, citing safety concerns. I shouldn't have witnessed that unsettling burial, and I shouldn't have ventured into the barn. I can't question my father. He passed away many years ago. Even more unsettling is the fact that my father did own a small pickup truck at that time. I didn't connect the dots until much later. Perhaps it's all a colossal coincidence. My father was a good man, a simple farmer. We were fortunate to afford luxuries that most farm families couldn't, like expensive computers and early internet access. Just a coincidence, right? The county general watchman, Arthur Jenkins, wasn't afraid of the dark. As a night shift security guard at County General Hospital, darkness was his constant companion. For 10 years, he'd patrolled the quiet corridors, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He knew every creak of the old building, every hum of the aging machinery, every subtle shift in air pressure that signaled a change in the weather. But that night, something was different. It was a Tuesday in late October, around 3 a.m. Arthur was making his usual rounds, starting on the ground floor and working his way up. Everything seemed normal. Mrs. Davison at the front desk was engrossed in her nightly crossword puzzle. The ER was relatively quiet, just a few patients being treated for minor ailments. The cafeteria was dark and locked, the gift shop's motion sensor light flickering on as he passed. 4th floor, psychiatric ward, all secure. 5th floor, maternity. He could hear the faint cry of a newborn baby somewhere down the hall. 6th floor, oncology. The night nurse, a weary-looking woman named Sarah, gave him a tired wave. 7th floor, mostly empty, used for storage and some disused administrative offices. Then the east corridor of the 8th floor. That's where the unease began. It started with the cold. The hospital's heating system was notoriously temperamental, but this was different. This was a bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Arthur could see his breath forming white clouds in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the already unsettling hallway seem even more menacing. This wasn't unusual in the older sections of the hospital, but tonight it felt different. And then there was the silence. Hospitals were never truly silent, even at night. There was always a background hum of activity. The whirring of ventilation systems, the distant murmur of voices, the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. But this silence was profound, absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled all sound. That's when Arthur saw it. About 50 feet ahead, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, standing with its back to him. It was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, but it was dirty and torn, hanging loosely on its gaunt frame. The figure's head was bald, the skin a sickly, grayish-white color. "Hey!" Arthur called out, his voice echoing in the silence. Hospital protocol dictated that he identify himself first, ask questions later. "This area is restricted. You need to return to your room." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it started to move away from him, towards the sealed double doors at the far end of the corridor. This gait was unsettling. Each step seemed labored, painful, the legs bending in ways that made Arthur's stomach churn. He reached for his radio, his hand fumbling with the clip on his belt. "Front desk, this is Jenkins. Got a patient wandering on 8 East. Requesting backup." Static. Nothing but static. He tried again. "Front desk, do you copy? I need assistance on 8 East." Still nothing. The figure reached the double doors. These were the entrance to the old psychiatric wing, a section of the hospital that had been closed down in 2003 after a fire. The doors were heavy steel, chained and padlocked. Arthur had checked those locks himself just 20 minutes earlier. "Stop right there," Arthur shouted, his voice rising in pitch. He started walking faster, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. "You can't go in there. It's dangerous." The figure paused. Slowly, deliberately, its head began to turn. Not its body, just its head, rotating much further than a human neck should be capable of. Arthur caught a glimpse of its face and froze. There were no eyes, just smooth, gray skin where eyes should have been. The mouth was a gaping, lipless gash, filled with something that gleamed wetly in the beam of Arthur's flashlight. Teeth. Too many and too sharp. His training, years of security protocols, evaporated in an instant. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that thing. But his legs were locked in place, his muscles frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The thing's mouth opened wider, a silent, grotesque yawn. A sound emerged, not a scream, not a growl, but something in between, like wet fabric tearing or the rasp of bone against bone. Then it stepped backward through the solid steel doors and vanished. Arthur stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like an eternity. The cold was intense, biting through his uniform, chilling him to the bone. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. Finally, he forced himself to move. He walked, slowly, hesitantly, towards the doors. The chains were still intact, the padlock still securely fastened. No sign of forced entry, no indication that anything had passed through. But on the floor, in front of the doors, was a single wet footprint. It was slowly fading, evaporating into the air, but it was undeniably there. A print that was too long, too narrow, the toes splayed in an unnatural way. Arthur ran. He ran all the way back to the security office on the ground floor, his lungs burning, his legs aching. "Mrs. Davison looked up from her crossword puzzle as he burst in, her eyes widening in alarm. "Arthur, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He gasped for breath, trying to regain control of his voice. Did you get my radio call?" "What call?" Mrs. Davison frowned. "The radio's been working fine all night. I just talked to Rodriguez on the ground floor." Arthur didn't explain. He went to the security monitors, pulling up the feed from the 8th floor East Corridor camera. Nothing. Just an empty hallway, the flickering fluorescent lights casting their usual shadows. He rewound the footage, his hands shaking as he searched for the timestamp corresponding to his encounter. There he was, walking down the corridor, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He watched himself stop, stand perfectly still for almost 5 minutes, then turn and run. But there was no figure in a hospital gown. No impossible creature with no eyes and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Just Arthur, alone in the hallway, apparently reacting to nothing. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Who would believe him? He was a security guard, a man of logic and observation, not a purveyor of fantastical tales. He knew how it would sound. "I saw a monster in the hospital." He'd be labeled as unstable, unreliable, maybe even lose his job. So he kept quiet. He did his rounds, wrote his reports, and tried to forget. But he couldn't. The 8th floor got colder every night. Equipment started malfunctioning, not just radios, but phones, cameras, even the automatic doors. Always in that east corridor, always around 3 a.m. The nurses complained of feeling uneasy, of being watched. They started avoiding that section of the hospital after dark. A week after the first incident, Arthur saw it again. This time, it was on the 7th floor, in a storage room filled with old medical equipment. He was doing his routine check when he heard a scraping sound from above. He looked up, and there it was, clinging to the ceiling like some grotesque insect. Its limbs splayed, its eyeless face turned towards him. It left wet footprints on the ceiling, marks that vanished within seconds. Arthur ran. Again, he checked the security cameras. Again, nothing. The third time was in the stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors. He was taking the stairs, avoiding the elevators after the second incident, when he saw it crouched in a corner landing, making that wet, tearing sound. When it saw him, it smiled. A grotesque, lipless grin that stretched all the way to where its eyes should have been. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Arthur started researching the hospital's history. He spent his days off in the local library, poring over old newspaper archives and microfilmed records. He discovered that the fire in the old psychiatric wing wasn't the only tragedy that had occurred at County General. In 1998, a patient named Marcus Cole had murdered 3 nurses and 2 other patients before killing himself. The official report said he'd used a stolen scalpel, but the rumors, whispered among the older staff, were far more disturbing. They spoke of bodies found partially consumed. Cole had been tall and thin, his body ravaged by cancer and chemotherapy. The nurse's notes described him as having an unusual degree of flexibility, an almost unnatural ability to contort his limbs. Some kind of rare connective tissue disorder, they speculated. Arthur was writing this all down now, sitting at his desk in the security office. It was 2:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, he had to start his rounds. The temperature in the office was already dropping. His radio was crackling with static, a faint, rhythmic interference that made his teeth ache. Yesterday, he'd found old blueprints of the 8th floor, tucked away in a forgotten file cabinet. The psychiatric wing wasn't completely sealed off. There was a maintenance tunnel, a narrow, claustrophobic passage that connected it to the main building. According to the plans, the tunnel emerged in a storage closet on the 7th floor, the same closet where the cleaning staff kept complaining about missing supplies and strange noises. He'd been having dreams, too. Nightmares, really. In them, he was walking through the abandoned psychiatric wing, the fire damage still visible on the walls, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. He was searching for something important, something that had been left behind when they sealed off the wing. In the dreams, he could hear that wet, tearing sound, getting closer and closer. And he knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the thing he'd been seeing in the hospital wasn't Marcus Cole. It was something else, something that had been using Cole's body, something that had been there long before Cole arrived, and had remained long after he was gone. The night shift supervisor, a man named Mr. Davies, had called Arthur into his office yesterday. He'd said Arthur seemed distracted lately, not himself. He'd asked if everything was okay at home, mentioned that other staff members had noticed Arthur talking to himself during rounds. He'd suggested, gently but firmly, that Arthur might want to consider taking some time off. Arthur hadn't told him about the thing in the hallways. He hadn't told him about the dreams, or the blueprints, or the growing certainty in his gut that something profoundly wrong was happening in the hospital. He just nodded, smiled weakly, and said he was fine, just a little tired. But he knew what he had to do. Tonight, after his 3 a.m. round, he was going into that maintenance tunnel. He had to see what was in the old psychiatric wing. He had to understand what this thing was and what it wanted. The temperature in the office dropped another 10 degrees. His coffee cup vibrated slightly on the desk. The static on the radio grew louder, more insistent. It was time for his rounds. Update. 4:15 a.m. Arthur found the entrance to the maintenance tunnel exactly where the blueprints indicated, behind a stack of cleaning supplies in a storage closet on the 7th floor. The lock was old and rusted, easily broken with a firm tug of his crowbar. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders. The walls were rough concrete, cold and damp to the touch. There were no lights. The beam of his flashlight only reached about 10 feet ahead, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something sickly sweet, like rotting meat. He could hear movement up ahead.
Wet slithering sounds.
And breathing, a slow, raspy breathing that wasn't quite human. The thing was waiting for him. He knew that now. It had been waiting all along. His flashlight was starting to flicker, the battery draining far faster than it should. He'd put in fresh batteries just before his shift. If anyone finds this, tell them I wasn't crazy. Tell them to seal up this tunnel. Tell them to burn this whole place down if they have to. It's looking at me now. No eyes, but it's looking at me. That smile. It's getting wider. I think I finally understand what it wants. So hungry. And I followed it home. End of recording. The subsequent investigation found Arthur Jenkins's flashlight and crowbar at the entrance to the maintenance tunnel. His body was never recovered. The tunnel itself was found to be structurally unsound and was permanently sealed with concrete. The official report attributed Arthur's disappearance to a cave-in, a tragic accident. But the nurses on the 7th and 8th floors still whisper about strange sounds in the night, about flickering lights and sudden drops in temperature. They still avoid the east corridor of the 8th floor after dark. And sometimes, when the hospital is quiet, they swear they can hear a faint, wet, tearing sound coming from somewhere deep within the walls. The sound of something hungry, waiting, the Dream Walker's Trail. Ethan Hayes, a software consultant from Seattle, had always considered himself a rational, logical man. He dealt in code, in algorithms, in the tangible world of ones and zeros. The supernatural, the paranormal, the unexplained, these were concepts he dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations and faulty wiring. Then came the dreams. They started 3 months ago, subtle at first, then increasingly vivid and disturbing. Every night, without fail, Ethan found himself walking through a dense, primeval forest. The trees were impossibly tall and close together, their branches intertwined, blocking out almost all light. There was no trail, no path, just an endless expanse of towering trunks and tangled undergrowth. And there was something else in the forest. He'd see it, always in the same place, always standing perfectly still. A figure, cloaked in a black, hooded robe, impossibly tall and slender. Its face, if it even had a face, was hidden within the depths of the hood. He couldn't see its eyes, but he could feel them, a cold, unnerving gaze that seemed to penetrate his very being. The figure never moved, never spoke. It just watched. Ethan would wake up at precisely 3:17 a.m., his heart pounding, his sheets soaked with sweat, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves clinging to his nostrils. He tried everything to stop the dreams. Sleep medication, meditation techniques, even a consultation with a therapist, Dr. Albright. "It's likely stress, Ethan," Dr. Albright had said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You've been through a lot lately. Your subconscious is processing things. Perhaps you need a change of scenery. Get away for a while. Do something enjoyable." That's how he ended up here on this ill-fated camping trip. His friends, Lucas and Ben, avid outdoorsmen, had been trying to persuade him to join them on a hiking expedition for years. Ethan had always resisted, preferring the predictable comforts of city life. But Dr. Albright's suggestion, coupled with the relentless nightmares, had finally pushed him to agree. They drove for 5 hours, deep into the Cascade Mountains, following a series of winding logging roads that grew increasingly rough and treacherous. The plan was to hike to Crystal Lake, a remote alpine lake known for its pristine beauty and abundant fish, spend 3 days camping, and then return to civilization. The first day had gone smoothly enough. They'd set up camp in a small clearing about half a mile from the lake, their tents a colorful cluster against the backdrop of towering pines. Lucas, ever the optimist, had brought his expensive, high-tech tent. Ben, the practical one, had his trusty, well-worn Coleman. Ethan had borrowed his brother's old two-person tent, a simple, no-frills affair. They'd grilled sausages, drank beer, and swapped stories around the campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. For the first time in months, Ethan had felt a sense of peace, a reprieve from the relentless dread that had become his constant companion. That night, for the first time in 3 months, he didn't dream. He woke up to silence, a silence that was wrong. There were no birds singing, no wind rustling through the trees, no sounds of Lucas or Ben moving around the campsite. Just an unnerving, absolute stillness. Ethan unzipped his tent and crawled outside. The clearing was empty. Lucas and Ben's tents were gone, vanished, as if they'd never been there at all. The fire pit was cold and clean, the ashes meticulously swept away. Even their backpacks, their hiking gear, their footprints, all gone. The only sign that anyone had ever been there was Ethan's own tent, standing alone in the center of the clearing. He checked his phone. No signal, of course. He hadn't expected one. But the time displayed on the screen sent a jolt of fear through him. 3:17 a.m. That's when he saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open space, was the figure from his dreams. The hooded figure, tall, impossibly slender, its black robe hanging in perfect stillness, despite a faint breeze that rustled the leaves around it. This wasn't a dream. This was real. His hood was tilted slightly downward, angled directly towards him. He couldn't see its face, but he knew it was watching him. He could feel that same cold, unnerving gaze, the same sensation of being observed, dissected, known. Ethan's mind raced, desperately trying to find a rational explanation. A prank? Some elaborate, cruel joke orchestrated by Lucas and Ben? But that made no sense. They wouldn't have abandoned him here, miles from anywhere, with no supplies, no way to contact anyone. He tried shouting, calling out for his friends, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness of the forest. No response. His voice seemed to die a few feet from his mouth, swallowed by the unnatural silence. He considered running, fleeing into the woods, but a primal instinct told him that would be a mistake. He had no idea where he was going, and whatever that thing was, it clearly knew how to move through this forest. He'd be lost, vulnerable, an easy target. He decided to stay put, to try to reason with whatever it was. But as he took a tentative step forward, the figure shifted slightly. Not moving from its spot, but adjusting its posture as if preparing to what? Ethan froze. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to document what was happening, to record it, to leave some kind of evidence in case something happened to him. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. He started recording a video, his voice a shaky whisper, narrating what he was seeing, what he was feeling. It's 3:17 a.m., he stammered into the camera. I'm at the campsite. Lucas and Ben. They're gone. Their tents are gone. Everything's gone. Except for that. He panned the camera towards the figure, still standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. The phone screen showed nothing, just trees. The figure, despite being clearly visible to his naked eye, didn't appear on the recording. Ethan's blood ran cold. Ethan lowered his phone, his mind reeling. The figure was there. He could see it, feel its presence, but the camera showed nothing. It was as if it existed on a different plane of reality, visible to him but invisible to technology. He tried taking a picture. Same result, just trees. He tried calling Lucas and Ben's numbers, even though he knew it was futile. Straight to voicemail. He considered his options, each one more terrifying than the last. He could stay here in the clearing and wait for something. He could try to hike out, risking getting lost in the vast, unfamiliar wilderness. Or he could approach the figure. The last option, the most insane of all, was the one that felt strangely compelling. A morbid curiosity, A desperate need to understand what was happening began to override his fear. He took a step forward, then another. The figure didn't move. He kept walking, slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the hooded form. As he got closer, he noticed details he hadn't seen before. The way the black robe seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it, making it appear darker than the surrounding darkness. The way its edges seemed to shimmer, to blur, as if it wasn't quite solid. He was about 20 feet away when he heard it. A whisper, faint, almost inaudible, but definitely there. It seemed to come from the figure itself, or perhaps from the air around it. Ethan, his name, spoke his name. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there watching him. Then he noticed something else. The air around the figure was distorted, like looking through heat haze, but colder, much colder. He could feel the temperature dropping rapidly, his breath forming white clouds in front of his face. He took another step forward, drawn by an irresistible force. He had to know. He had to understand. He was 10 feet away when the figure finally moved. It raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed towards the woods, towards a narrow, barely discernible gap between the trees. A path that hadn't been there before. "Follow." The whisper came again, stronger this time, more insistent. Ethan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But another part of him, a part he didn't recognize, a part that seemed to be resonating with the figure's presence, urged him forward. He took a step onto the path, then another. The figure remained where it was, watching him, its unseen eyes following his every move. As he entered the woods, the trees seemed to close in around him, the darkness deepening, the silence becoming absolute. He could no longer see the clearing, or the figure. He was alone, on a path that shouldn't exist, following a summons he couldn't explain. He walked for what felt like hours, the path twisting and turning, leading him deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. The air grew colder, the scent of decay stronger. He could hear whispers all around him now, not just the single voice, but a chorus of them, murmuring unintelligible words, just on the edge of hearing. Then he saw it, a light, ahead, through the trees. He quickened his pace, drawn towards the light, his fear mixed with a growing sense of anticipation. He emerged into another clearing, and there, standing in the center, was himself, or rather a version of himself. Standing in the center of the clearing, bathed in the pale, ethereal light, was a figure that was identical to Ethan in every way. Same height, same build, same clothes, even the same bewildered expression on his face. But there were differences, subtle, unsettling differences. This other Ethan's eyes were completely black, devoid of any white, reflecting the light like polished obsidian. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint bluish tinge. And his clothes, while identical to Ethan's own, seemed to hang on him differently, as if his body were less substantial somehow. The two Ethans stared at each other, mirror images in a nightmare landscape. Who are you?" Ethan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The other Ethan smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am you," he said, his voice a distorted echo of Ethan's own. "Or, rather, what you will be." What do you mean?" "You've been chosen, Ethan," the other Ethan said, his voice taking on a strange, hypnotic quality. "Chosen to cross over, to join us." "Join who?" "The ones who walk between worlds," the other Ethan said. "The ones who see beyond the veil. The ones who understand the true nature of reality." He gestured towards the surrounding forest. "This is not your world, Ethan. Not anymore. Your world is limited, constrained. Here there are no limits, no boundaries, only possibilities." Ethan felt a strange pull, a seductive yearning for something he couldn't quite define. A part of him wanted to believe, wanted to accept this impossible reality, to embrace the unknown. But another part, the rational, logical part that had defined his entire life, screamed in protest. This was madness. This was a hallucination, a delusion, a dream. I don't understand, Ethan said, his voice shaking. The other Ethan took a step closer, his black eyes boring into Ethan's. You will, he said, in time. But first you must let go. Let go of your fear, your doubt, your limitations. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and slender, almost translucent. Take my hand, Ethan, and I will show you. Ethan hesitated. He looked at the outstretched hand, at the smiling face, at the black, empty eyes. He looked at the surrounding forest, at the ethereal light, at the path that had led him here. He thought of his life back in Seattle, his job, his friends, his ex-wife. He thought of the dreams, the relentless nightmares, the feeling of being watched, the growing sense of dread that had consumed him for months. And he knew that this wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability. He reached out and took the other Ethan's hand. The moment their fingers touched, a jolt of energy surged through him, a cold electric shock that made his muscles spasm. He felt a tearing sensation, a ripping apart of his very being. He cried out, a wordless scream that was swallowed by the silence of the forest. Then, darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing in the clearing, alone. The other Ethan was gone. The path had vanished. The trees looked normal. The light was the pale, gray light of dawn. He felt different, lighter somehow, less burdened. He looked down at his hands. They were still his hands, but different. The skin was paler, almost translucent. He could see the faint blue tracery of veins beneath the surface. He raised his hand to his face, touching his cheek. His skin felt cold. He looked around the clearing, his eyes scanning the trees. He saw a movement, a flicker of darkness at the edge of his vision. He turned, and there it was, another figure, tall, slender, cloaked in black. Watching him, he understood now. He was one of them, a walker between worlds. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. And he waited, waiting for the next lost soul to wander off the trail, to follow the whispers in the woods, to find their way to the clearing, and to join them. He knew he must find his replacement, the melancholy whistler of Stillwater Lane. The air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and impending rain, a typical summer night in the sleepy hamlet of Stillwater. I, Samuel Blackwood, had just returned from an evening out with my friends, a rare indulgence in my otherwise quiet life. It was midnight, the witching hour, and as I stepped onto my porch, I saw him, a stranger, shuffling past my house with an unsettling gait. He was dressed incongruously in a suit and tie, an attire utterly out of place on our tranquil rural street. Hey, friend, everything all right? I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The stranger ignored me, continuing his slow, deliberate progress down the road. A flicker of unease sparked within me. I knew most of the residents along Stillwater Lane. Some were even distant relatives. Ignoring my gut feeling, that insistent whisper of something amiss felt like a betrayal of my own instincts. I climbed back into my aging Ford pickup, reasoning that it offered a measure of protection should the stranger prove to be unpredictable. I set off in pursuit. He hadn't gotten far. I rolled up beside him, cracking the passenger window. You okay, sir? I asked again, my voice a little less confident this time. The stranger was drenched in sweat, his face glistening in the moonlight. His glasses were fogged, obscuring his eyes, but I could sense a profound distance in his gaze. He looked to be in his late 30s, perhaps younger, his features etched with a weariness that belied his years. Sir, I pressed, did your car break down somewhere? Without looking at me, the man answered in a low, hushed tone. No. Are you staying nearby? There was a pregnant pause, a silence that stretched on, filled only by the chirping of crickets. Then, another quiet, no. I kept my truck rolling at the stranger's pace, my eyes drawn to his trembling hands. He exuded an aura of palpable anxiety. Whether it was caused by my presence or something else entirely, I couldn't say, but his behavior only heightened my concern. "Do you need me to call someone?"
No.
I observed him silently for another moment, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, to leave this unsettling encounter behind. Yet, I found myself asking, "Do you need a ride?" The man stopped walking. I hit the brakes, my truck coming to a halt beside him. He stood motionless, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. Then, slowly, he turned only his head, his eyes finally meeting mine. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned his gaze back to the road ahead and resumed walking. I didn't follow. To quell the growing unease, I drove past my house and headed to my cousin, Clara's place. She lived just 3 houses down. Usually, Clara and her family were asleep by 10, but to my surprise, the lights were still blazing. I hurried to the door and knocked, a sense of urgency gripping me. Clara's husband, Daniel, a sturdy man with a perpetually worried expression, cautiously cracked the door open. Seeing it was me, he relaxed visibly.
Sam?
"What's going on?" "Hey, Daniel," I said, my eyes drawn to the shotgun hanging by his side. "Something's got you on edge." Daniel sighed, a weary sound. "Yeah, a little. Come on in." I stepped inside, the air thick with tension. "Where's Clara?" "I'm here," Clara whispered, emerging from her children's room, gently closing the door behind her. "What are you doing here so late, Sam?" I scratched the back of my head, feeling a bit foolish. "There's a guy, dressed in a suit and tie, walking down the road. He's acting strange. He came from this direction. I just wanted to make sure everyone was okay." Daniel and Clara exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke volumes. "I think he might have been over here earlier," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" "I was in the backyard with the dogs, letting them do their business before bed, when I heard whistling." "Whistling?" "Yeah, like a person whistling a tune." Once she glanced at Daniel, who nodded in confirmation. "You know we've got that fence back there now, so the dogs don't wander off. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them moving right along the perimeter of the fence." A chill ran down my spine. "Did the dogs freak out?" "That's the weirdest part," Clara said, shaking her head. "They didn't. They bark at anything and everything any other time. But this time, they just kept sniffing the grass, like the whistling wasn't even happening." "What did you do?" "I ran inside and told Daniel. He went outside and looked, searched the whole yard, and didn't see anybody," Clara explained. Daniel added, "I checked the road, too. Walked down to the end of the driveway and looked both ways. Nothing. Think it might have been a bird?" I suggested, grasping at straws. Clara shook her head emphatically. "No way. This was a person." "Maybe we should call the cops," I said, the suggestion feeling both necessary and inadequate. Clara and Daniel agreed. Daniel pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. We gave the dispatcher the stranger's description, and they assured us they'd send a unit to investigate. "I'm going to get in my truck and see if I can find him," I said after Daniel hung up. "Don't do anything stupid, Sam," Clara pleaded, her eyes filled with worry. "I won't. I just want to get eyes on him." I headed for the door, but Clara stopped me. "Why don't you stay here tonight, Sam?" I turned and smiled, trying to reassure her. "I'll be all right. Besides, I've got to go let my dog, Buster, out." "Bring him over here with you," Clara urged. I hugged Clara, a quick, awkward embrace. "I'll call you when I see him." Clara didn't argue further, but she waved goodbye with a look that suggested I was taking her heart with me and might not be bringing it back anytime soon. Once I reached my house, I bypassed it, continuing my search for the stranger. It was reasonable to assume he'd be well down the road by then, but I ended up driving much further than he too could have possibly walked, without finding a single trace of him. Instead, I encountered the deputy. I slowed down next to his patrol car and rolled down my window. A mustachioed deputy, Officer Miller, looked back at me. I explained that we were the ones who had called, and that the stranger seemed to have vanished. Officer Miller assured me he'd keep looking, and we parted ways. There wasn't much else for me to do but go home, so I did. I pulled up the gravel driveway, shut off the engine, and headed inside. Opening the door startled Buster, as it usually did, but his barking subsided when I flicked on the lights. "Hey, boy," I said, petting him affectionately. I held the door open, and he bounded outside to relieve himself. I stood beneath the starlit sky, watching Buster sniff the earth, when I heard it, a whistling tune emanating from behind the house. It carried through the air, a haunting melody, like a song carried on the wind. But this was a night of utter stillness. The trees were motionless, not a breeze stirred. The melody grew clearer, floating around the house, seemingly to my side. It was undeniably human, and yet Buster didn't bark. Primal fear gripped me. I hurried Buster inside, grabbed a baseball bat I kept by the door, and ventured around the house, my senses on high alert, ready to swing at any perceived threat. Every shadow seemed a trespasser that night. Every falling branch, every rustling leaf, every hooting owl, every chirping cricket, every hopping rabbit, every creeping raccoon, all amplified by the unsettling silence and the haunting whistle. But none of it was the stranger in the suit. I called Clara after I heard the whistle and relayed what had happened. I told her Officer Miller was out looking, but as morning dawned, it became clear that the stranger had never been found, and that, we thought, was the end of it. Mr. Henderson, a kind, elderly gentleman, lived 2 houses down from me. For as long as I could remember, he had been a paraplegic, confined to a wheelchair, living a solitary existence. Mr. Henderson was the last person you'd expect to take his own life. But 2 days after we heard the whistling, Mr. Henderson was found hanging from a tree behind his house, a tree he undoubtedly couldn't have reached on his own. The detectives said he looked like he'd been hanging there for a couple of days. The tragedy didn't end there. 2 houses down from Mr. Henderson's place lived a young couple, Ethan and Sarah Miller. Both were healthy, vibrant, and Coast Guard veterans, accustomed to spending long hours in the water. Yet, despite their physical fitness, they were found dead in their bathtub the day after Mr. Henderson's body was discovered drowned. And, as you might have guessed, from the looks of it, they'd been in there for about 3 days. There's a chilling commonality we've discovered since then among those of us along Stillwater Lane who are still living. Someone in their household heard the whistling that night. They heard it, they investigated, and they found nothing. Could it be that the 3 who died never heard the whistling? I don't sleep well anymore. 3 consumed by a gnawing fear that I'll miss the whistling tune. A warning that no dog can hear, a harbinger of something unspeakably dark. The shadow of the rails. My 21st birthday marked a turning point, a descent into a routine I'm not proud of in retrospect. I became a regular at the local pubs, spending far too much time and money on nights out with my friends. I was living on the fringes of Oak Haven, a small, affluent town where trouble rarely ventured. I didn't own a car, nor did I possess a cell phone, those being luxuries beyond my means at the time. The walk downtown was a 45-minute trek, a distance that didn't bother me physically, but the return journey, often in a state of inebriation, presented a different challenge. Oak Haven was generally a safe place, a community where the most significant threat was the occasional overly enthusiastic college student. Walking home alone at night, even after a few drinks, wasn't something that caused me undue concern, aside from the potential for a run-in with the law. I wasn't reckless, but I was young, and the possibility of being picked up for public intoxication loomed large. This particular night was a Tuesday, which meant cheap pints at the Rusty Mug. I wouldn't say I was completely wasted, but I was certainly well beyond tipsy. Instead of taking the well-lit sidewalks where I risked encountering a patrol car, I opted for the bike path that ran alongside the train tracks. It was a longer route, but it felt safer, less likely to lead to any unwanted attention. Or so I naively believed. The bike path was poorly lit, a ribbon of darkness snaking through the outskirts of town. Looking back, with the wisdom of experience, I should have been far more apprehensive about walking alone in that inky blackness at 2 a.m. But I was 21, arrogant, and my thoughts were consumed by fleeting fantasies of romance, not the potential dangers lurking in the shadows. I'd taken this path countless times before. Encounters with other people were rare, and if I did cross paths with someone, it was usually another inebriated college student with the same idea, or perhaps a homeless person, none of whom had ever posed a threat. So, there I was, strolling along, my senses dulled by alcohol, when I noticed a figure further down the path, walking towards me. He was wearing a large hiking backpack and a hoodie pulled low over his head, obscuring his face. The darkness was so complete that I could only make out his silhouette, a vaguely human shape moving against the backdrop of night. The person's gait, a distinct, almost lumbering walk, unquestionably identified him as male. I assumed he was probably a transient, though it seemed odd to see someone heading towards downtown at that hour. As we drew closer, and we were about to pass each other, this person abruptly stopped. He stood perfectly still, and I could feel his gaze fixed on me. His head followed me as I walked by, a subtle, unsettling movement that sent a shiver down my spine. It was unnerving, to say the least, and a nagging sense of unease began to creep into my consciousness. I continued walking, trying to shrug off the encounter, but something felt off. A primal instinct, a gut feeling, told me something wasn't right. I stopped and turned around. He was still there, still staring at me. "What?" I asked, my voice a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. I stopped walking and stared back at him, my bravado fueled by a mixture of alcohol and youthful recklessness. That's when he hissed at me. It wasn't a human sound, not entirely. It was a long, drawn-out, vicious hiss, like a snake, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I'd hoped he was just being eccentric, perhaps under the influence of something stronger than alcohol. I forced a nervous laugh. "Okay," I muttered, and continued walking. I took a few more steps, then glanced back. He had somehow managed to get closer, closing the distance without making a sound. He stood completely motionless, a statue of darkness. I started to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was just drunk, imagining things. I turned back around and walked, taking a few more steps. Then I looked back again. He was definitely closer. It was impossible. I couldn't hear him approaching, not a single footfall. What unsettled me even more was his uncanny ability to stop and remain perfectly still every time I turned around. Are you following me, buddy?" I asked, my voice laced with a nervous tremor. Again, he responded with that creepy hiss, his eyes unwavering, locked onto mine. Now, I was genuinely freaked out. A strange, terrifying sensation washed over me, the feeling of being prey, of being hunted. "Hey, screw you, man," I yelled, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and anger. In hindsight, this was a terrible decision, a reckless act of provocation. I already felt like a target, and the last thing I should have been doing was antagonizing this thing. I started backing away, my eyes never leaving him. He just stood there, hissing. The hisses were growing longer, louder, more menacing. There was a palpable malice in them now, a predatory intent. He started to move, to pursue. At first, it was just slow, deliberate steps. But the further I backed away, the faster he moved, taking larger, more purposeful strides towards me. "Forget this," I muttered to myself. "I'm getting out of here." I broke into a run, a full-fledged sprint. He started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots pounding the pavement behind me, gaining ground. He was hissing like a cat, growling like a dog, a cacophony of animalistic sounds that fueled my terror. I could feel his spit hitting the back of my neck. "Get away from me!" I screamed, my voice hoarse with fear. I might have even wet myself, I was so scared. All I could think about was running, reaching the safety of my house as quickly as possible. I've always been a fast runner, but this guy was much taller than me with long legs. He was rapidly closing the distance. I managed to maintain a 5-foot gap, constantly checking behind me, seeing his arms reaching out, grasping, trying to grab me. Finally, I reached the end of the bike path and emerged onto the crossing sidewalk, a street illuminated by street lamps and the occasional passing car. I was overwhelmed with relief, finally back in civilization. There was a gas station near my house, the quick stop, and I thought I could run there, seek refuge inside. But as I approached, I saw that the lights were off, the doors locked. It was closed. I had to make it to my house. As I got closer, I could see the lights on in my roommate, Liam's window. "Liam! Liam!" I shouted, my voice desperate. "Liam, open the door! Open the door! I'm being chased!" I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me. I saw the front door of my house swing open, and Liam stood there, looking utterly bewildered. I ran up the steps and practically leaped inside, slamming the door shut behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" Liam asked, his eyes wide with confusion. You didn't see the guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and peered outside. He was gone, vanished. I had no idea what happened to him, but I knew with absolute certainty that what I'd experienced was real. Whoever that hissing, pursuing figure was, he had shaken me to my core. I never walked down that bike path after dark again. The shadow of that encounter lingered, a constant reminder of the unseen dangers that lurk in the darkness. The whispers behind apartment 19. Years ago, when I first embarked on the adventure of independent living, my aspirations were modest. Affordable rent, a landlord who wasn't a nightmare, and neighbors who wouldn't drive me to the brink of insanity. As it turned out, the last of those wishes proved to be the most elusive. The walls in these old apartment buildings, you see, are notoriously thin, some more so than others. My building, the Elmwood, was a prime example of this architectural flaw. Shortly after moving into apartment 17, I became aware of a distinct sound emanating from the unit next door, apartment 19. It was a wailing, a mournful lament that echoed through the shared wall each and every night. It sounded like an elderly woman in profound distress, a sound that tugged at my empathy and, simultaneously, grated on my nerves. But it wasn't constant. It adhered to a peculiar schedule, lasting precisely 2 hours. Whether it started at 8 p.m. and ended at 10 p.m., or commenced at 7:00 p.m. and concluded at 9 p.m., or even began as early as 6 p.m. and ceased at 8 p.m., the duration was always 2 hours. It was as if a timer were set, triggering and then silencing the woman's sorrow. Initially, I decided that being a considerate neighbor meant respecting her privacy, allowing her to grieve in peace. Perhaps this nightly ritual was her way of coping, a cathartic release. Maybe she cooked dinner, watched reruns of classic television shows, and then wept for 2 hours. Crying, after all, is a fundamental human expression, a way to process emotions. Could have been therapeutic for her, a necessary outlet. But that assumption only held for so long. After nearly a month, the nightly wailing persisted, unwavering in its intensity and duration. It began to interfere with my own life. I hesitated to invite friends over, fearful that the woman's miserable routine would commence at any moment, casting a pall over the evening. It was at this point that my definition of good neighbor shifted. I decided I needed to check on her to ensure her well-being. So, on approximately the 15th night in that apartment, I muted my television, took a deep breath, and walked the short distance down the hall to apartment 19. I rapped on the wooden door, painted a faded shade of red, with the number 19 affixed to its center, 3 firm, deliberate knocks. The instant the third knock reverberated, the wailing ceased. Abruptly, the silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the crying. Then, a seemingly rehearsed commotion began inside. "Arthur, darling, I think someone's at the door." The woman's voice, frail and shaky, called out. A man's voice, presumably Arthur, responded in a hushed whisper. "Would you mind getting it, dear? I've got a pot on the stove." The whispers grew louder, competing with the hiss of a boiling kettle and the blare of a television. It sounded like a football game, but it was May, far outside the football season. Perhaps a rerun, a recording of a past game. The exchange continued, becoming more agitated, more guttural, as if they were engaged in a heated argument. "Oh, fine. 1 minute, I'll be right there," the woman finally called out, her voice strained. A few moments later, I heard the scrape of a chain sliding and falling, followed by the click of a deadbolt disengaging. Then the door creaked open. I looked down to see my neighbor, a hunched figure draped in a silky, purple polka dot nightgown. A strap looped around the back of her lumpy neck, connected to a pair of thick reading glasses that rested precariously on her nose. Her face, surprisingly, looked younger than her stooped posture suggested. A pungent odor, something rancid and vaguely unpleasant, wafted from the apartment. It reminded me of my parents' basement after a particularly bad flood when I was a child. I couldn't immediately determine if the smell originated from her or from the apartment itself. "Hello," she said, her voice a sort of sweet, gravelly murmur. "Hi," I replied, suddenly at a loss for words. "My name is Finn. I'm your neighbor. I just moved in next door, a couple of weeks ago, and I've been hearing some crying coming from your apartment. I just wanted to see if everything was okay." She paused, sniffled, and then said, "Oh, hello, Finn.
I'm Eleanor Finch.
And I've lived here for..." She placed a hand on her chest, causing the fabric of her nightgown to ripple, and looked off pensively into the hallway, as if lost in a labyrinth of memories. "Well, a long time. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Finch. And is everything okay in here?" "Yes, of course. Why do you ask?" "It's just that I've been hearing crying every night for the last couple of weeks since I moved in, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right." I peered past her, trying to get a glimpse inside the apartment. It was sparsely furnished. A brown leather couch, worn and faded with age, occupied the center of the room. A cheap floor lamp leaned precariously beside it, casting a dim, yellowish light over the far cushion. But other than that, there was nothing. No family photos, no artwork on the walls, no coffee tables, no end tables, not even a rug to cover the warped, uneven wooden floor. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive click of her tongue. "I'm an old woman, Finn, and sometimes I just forget things. I do apologize if my crying has been keeping you awake." "Not at all, but sometimes in my old age I forget things, a lot of things. And see, my children live far away now, and my husband, Arthur, passed a long time ago. And when you get to be my age, you've seen a lot of people and things come and go. Now, I just don't have much, you see. And when I lose things, it's just one more thing I don't have. And then I worry. If I lose the last thing I can rely on, my mind, I'll lose my independence too. Then I'll have nothing. It may sound dramatic, but the sieve is my mind, in a way. They seem to be disappearing together." Her explanation, unexpectedly poignant, moved me. I felt a lump form in my throat, an urge to offer comfort, to share in her sorrow. "Your sieve?" I managed to ask. "Yes, that thing. The one you use to drain water when you're done cooking pasta. I was just pressing my ravioli, and I swear I took the strainer out and placed it right on the cabinet over to there." She pointed vaguely towards a wall. "But by the time the water was done boiling, I couldn't find it anymore." I held the collar of my shirt over my nose, pinching it tightly, except when I was speaking to her. The stench was becoming unbearable. Based on where she was looking when she spoke, I suspected her vision wasn't very sharp. She was staring directly at the wall. In the dim light, I thought I noticed a dark, discolored patch on the wall. "Okay," I said. "I'll look for it. It's about this big," she said, demonstrating with her hands. "And round and silver. And my sister's husband, bless his soul, got it for me when he used to work at Williams-Sonoma out at the mall in Willow Creek. I've had it for 15 years. It's the same one I used to teach Clara, my granddaughter, how to cook spaghetti. We've had that recipe in my family for generations now." My mother's mother. She brought the recipe all the way from a chef she knew in Milan. And he was the sweetest man, this chef. He got married to Alessandra from Naples. She continued in this vein, a rambling, disjointed narrative. For the entire 10 minutes I searched for the strainer. And for the entire 10 minutes, she stared fixedly at that dark spot on the wall. But there was no strainer, and frankly, there weren't many places to look. Her apartment was roughly the same size as mine, a one-bedroom, one-bathroom unit, but it was remarkably uncluttered, almost barren. The kitchen was small and cramped, allowing only one of us to be in there at a time. Most of the cabinets I opened were empty. One held a few glasses, another 2 plates, and the rest were devoid of any contents. I wondered how she managed to cook anything with so little. The smell, however, became overwhelming after a short while. When it reached a point where I could no longer tolerate it, I finally said, "I'm sorry, Miss Finch. I can't seem to find it." "You and me both," she sighed. "That's quite all right. You've been lovely company. Which apartment do you live in?" 317, I said, already halfway out the door, eager to escape the suffocating odor. 17. If I lose anything else, could I trouble you to help me again? Sure, no problem, I said, relieved to breathe the relatively fresher air of the hallway. All right, thank you, Finn. I hope we have better luck next time. You've been so kind. Have a lovely evening. Thanks, you too, I replied, and the door clicked shut. I took a deep gulp of fresh air, and as I collected myself, several aspects of her apartment began to trouble me. It was similar in layout to mine, but so empty, so utterly devoid of the accumulated possessions that typically define a life. How could anyone live like that? Most elderly women I knew had an excess of belongings, not a scarcity. And then I remembered the kettle, the one she'd mentioned before opening the door. It wasn't there. The stove was pristine, not a single pot or pan in sight. There was no evidence that anyone had used the kitchen that night, or perhaps ever. And something else was missing, something even more perplexing than the missing kitchenware. The other person. She had been talking to someone before she opened the door. I was certain of it. But as far as I could tell, during the 10 minutes I was inside, she lived alone. And then there was that dark spot on the wall, no larger than a golf ball. She kept looking at it, studying it, but not in a way that suggested concern. She almost seemed to admire it. She smiled at it between sentences, holding her hand over her heart, as if she found it charming, endearing. I shivered at the thought, but eventually managed to dismiss it until I saw her again. Over the following weeks, I received a series of knocks on my door. Miss Finch seemed to remember which apartment I lived in without difficulty, but she could never quite get my name right. The first time she came over, she said she was missing her New Yorker magazine. We searched high and low, just as we had for the strainer. She regaled me with stories of her long-standing subscription, how her late husband, Arthur, used to write for them, but we never found it. I asked her if she still paid for the subscription, and she paused, a shaky finger suspended in the air, and thought for an uncomfortably long time before declaring, "I don't remember." A few nights later, Miss Finch claimed she'd lost her Aricept prescription, a common medication used to treat Alzheimer's disease. This time, I did find it, but only the empty orange bottle, the label shredded and torn in an almost animalistic manner. It was lying just beneath that dark spot on the wall, which, I swear, was growing larger. If it had been the size of a golf ball the first time I saw it, it was closer to the size of a basketball now. The next time she came over, Miss Finch was in tears. She told me she'd gone grocery shopping that morning, but when she returned from physical therapy, all her food was missing. Indeed, her pantry and refrigerator were both empty, save for a year-expired box of rice. This was the first time I'd learned that rice could expire. But what was strange was that I couldn't recall seeing the rice when I'd searched for the strainer. At the end of that brief, fruitless search, as I was leaving, the foul odor assaulting my nostrils, I caught a glimpse of that dark spot. It was undeniably larger. It could no longer be measured by the size of any sports ball. It was closer to the size of a small child, the rough shape of one, too. It had to be water damage, I reasoned, or some other terrible form of rot to cause that kind of decay in the wall. I emailed our landlord, Mr. Henderson, that night, but he never responded. The next time Miss Finch appeared at my door, she was more frantic than ever. She was still wearing a nightgown, but no glasses this time. She was shaking, almost shivering, and her droopy eyes darted nervously from side to side as she spoke. I lost my grandchildren, she said, her voice trembling. What do you mean, Miss Finch? Where are your ears, Ethan? I lost my grandchildren, she snapped, her voice rising in panic. I'd never seen her so distraught. Were they visiting? Yes. My granddaughter, Clara, was over, and her brother, Michael, was in the other room, playing with his trains. I was teaching her how to cook something. Oh, I can't remember. And then they were gone. Please help me. I need to find them. Their parents will be so upset with me. I shut my door behind me and followed her next door. Don't worry, we'll find them. I reassured her, but the question gnawed at me. How could she lose her grandchildren? I thought I was helping her, providing some semblance of peace of mind by assisting her in these searches. But it only seemed to be getting worse. She was losing people now. I began to question how far was too far. Was I truly helping her, or was I merely indulging the delusions of a deteriorating mind? Again, we went through the motions, searching every nook and cranny. But once again, there weren't many places to look. I suggested calling her daughter to see if the children were all right, and she eventually agreed. But when I picked up her landline, the phone didn't dial. I still pretended to speak to her daughter, Annie, engaging in a one-sided conversation with dead air. Hi, I'm calling from Miss Finch's phone. Yes, I'm her neighbor. We just wanted to check in to see how Clara and Michael are doing. Oh, they're with you? Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes, have a great night. Great heavens, thank you. Thank you so much, Finn, Miss Finch exclaimed, her voice filled with relief. I don't know what I'd do without you. I placed the phone back on the receiver, and just before I turned to leave, I noticed it wasn't plugged in, and that dark spot, that black spot was massive now. She couldn't possibly not see it. Could she? It overwhelmed the wall, bubbling in places, a grotesque, organic growth. I cautiously poked at it, feeling a wet, gooey texture that I instinctively wiped off on my shirt. Miss Finch, I began, my voice filled with a growing sense of dread. No response. I stared at the colossal blemish, its sheer size overwhelming. It towered over me, seeming to lean in, its tendrils reaching towards the ceiling. I think you should get this spot checked out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It looks like it could be water damage, or mold, or. I trailed off, unable to articulate the growing horror I felt. I turned around to see her standing with a straighter back than usual, making her appear several inches taller. Her posture was different. I think you ought to leave now, she said, her voice firm, devoid of the usual tremor. She was holding the disconnected phone in her hand, and so I did, and I never saw her again. No more late-night knocks on the door, and soon no more crying. A few weeks later, a couple 5 of movers arrived, hauling furniture out of her apartment. They carried that worn brown leather couch, the one I'd seen on my first visit. I asked them where they were taking it, and they told me to a dump, that the woman had been moved to a nursing home. Her dementia, they explained, had progressed to the point where her worst fears had finally come true. She had lost her independence. As I spoke with the movers, something crackled, then smashed against the floor inside the apartment, startling them enough to drop the couch in the hallway. I peered inside, curious about the commotion. At first, I saw only dust, a hazy cloud cascading over the floor, obscuring the point of impact. But as the dust settled, I realized which wall had collapsed, the one with the black spot. It had finally given way. Shards of moldy, blackened drywall littered the floor, along with fragments of something else. Something white, stained with black mold, but still recognizably white. I looked back towards the gaping hole in the wall, trying to identify the source of the debris. I hoped, desperately, that what I saw was fake, a macabre Halloween prank. I'd seen posts online about this kind of thing. Someone hiding a plastic skeleton inside the drywall, designed to scare the next unsuspecting tenant. But it wasn't plastic. Bits of desiccated flesh still clung to its wrists. His teeth were loose, falling out, rotted around the hardened gums. Maggots crawled through tiny holes in its pelvic bones and eye sockets. It nestled within the insulation as if lying peacefully in an upright bed. Then, its lower jawbone rocked loose and fell, shattering against the wooden floor. The three of us, the two movers and I, stared in horrified silence. The drywall creaked again, then flaked some more. Soon, the rest of the wall collapsed, crashing to the floor in a cacophony of splintering wood and crumbling plaster. Dust billowed once more, obscuring the scene for a few agonizing seconds. When it settled, my blood ran cold. I saw it all. The strainer, the magazines, folding chair, a couple of paintings, their canvases warped and stained, a box of old letters, their ink faded and blurred, the legs of a coffee table, pots and pans, even a television, its screen cracked and coated in a thick layer of grime, all of it spilling out from the moldy, decaying wall. I stared at the jawless skull of that skeleton, still propped up within the wall cavity, and it seemed to stare back at me, a silent, mocking accusation. I don't know how all of Ms. Finch's belongings ended up inside that wall, but the fact is, they did, and I probably won't ever know the full story. But for some inexplicable reason, I'm certain that skeleton, it didn't just know. It did all those things, too. I know it sounds insane, the ravings of a disturbed mind, but nothing can convince me that it wasn't torturing her, all that time, preying on her feeble mind. Maybe she wasn't as forgetful as she thought. Maybe someone was actively stealing her possessions, her memories, her very sanity. In these old apartment buildings, some walls are thinner than others. But the physical thinness of the walls paled in comparison to the thin veil separating reality from something far more sinister, something that resided within those decaying walls. I still wondered about her grandchildren, Clara and Michael. If everything else was in the wall, where were they? And just as I turned back towards my own apartment, my mind reeling, the drywall creaked one final time. A faint whisper, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the wreckage. It was Eleanor's voice, but distorted, hollow, devoid of the gentle tremor I'd come to associate with her. Lost, aren't we all? The sound, or perhaps the imagined sound, was enough to send me fleeing back into my own apartment, slamming the door shut behind me, locking every bolt, every chain. I spent the rest of the day huddled in a corner, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear, confusion, and a growing, unsettling certainty that I had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The whispers behind apartment 19 had ceased, but the echoes of that final, chilling question would haunt me forever. The Elmwood held secrets, dark and disturbing secrets, and I had inadvertently become a part of them. The house on Hemlock Lane. Miles Corbin needed a fresh start. After his marriage imploded, leaving him emotionally and financially drained, he craved escape from the suffocating familiarity of his old life. He found it, unexpectedly, in a Craigslist ad. Charming Victorian, rural Massachusetts, incredibly low rent, some TLC needed. The pictures showed a two-story house, painted a faded blue, with a wraparound porch and a surprisingly large yard. It looked lonely, perhaps, but also peaceful. And the price was astonishingly low, even for a fixer-upper in a remote location. Miles, a freelance graphic designer who could work from anywhere with a decent internet connection, contacted the landlord, a gruff-sounding man named Mr. Abernathy, who seemed more interested in getting the place rented than in screening potential tenants. The lease was signed, the keys mailed, and Miles packed his meager belongings into his aging Honda Civic and drove east. The house on Hemlock Lane was even more dilapidated in person than the pictures had suggested. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged precariously, and the yard was a wilderness of overgrown weeds. But the bones of the house were good, Miles reasoned, and the solitude was exactly what he craved. The previous owners had left behind a considerable amount of junk. Old furniture, dusty boxes, and a general accumulation of decades of living. Miles spent the first few days clearing out the clutter, relegating most of it to the basement, a damp, dimly lit space that he found vaguely unsettling. Among the discarded items was an old rotary phone, a heavy black Bakelite model that looked like it belonged in a museum. It sat on a shelf in a corner of the basement, gathering dust, its cord severed. Miles ignored it. He had no need for a landline, let alone an antique one. He had his cell phone, his laptop, his connection to the digital world. The past could stay in the past. He settled into a routine. Work during the day, explore the surrounding countryside in the afternoons, and quiet evenings spent reading or watching movies online. He made some progress on the house, patching holes in the walls, fixing leaky faucets, and attempting to tame the overgrown garden. Then, one night, about 3 weeks after he moved in, the phone rang. It was late, close to midnight. Miles was in his home office, a small room on the second floor, working on a website design. The wind was howling outside, rattling the old windows and making the whole house creak and groan. The sound, when it came, was unmistakable. The shrill, mechanical ring of an old rotary phone. Miles froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He must be imagining things. He hadn't had a landline in years, and certainly not a phone that sounded like that. The ringing continued, insistent, demanding. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the basement. He slowly removed his headphones, his heart starting to beat faster. There it was again. Ring, ring, ring. This is impossible, he muttered to himself. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, the sound amplified in the silence of the house. He walked to the top of the stairs, listening. The ringing was definitely coming from the basement. He descended the stairs slowly, cautiously, his hand gripping the railing. The air grew colder with each step. The basement light, a single bare bulb, cast long, dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The phone sat on the shelf, exactly where it had been for weeks, covered in a thick layer of dust. And it was ringing, loudly, insistently. Miles approached it slowly, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing and hearing with any semblance of logic. The phone wasn't connected to anything. The cord was cut, couldn't be ringing. He reached out, his hand trembling, and picked up the receiver. The ringing stopped. Miles held the heavy black receiver to his ear. He expected nothing. Silence. Or perhaps some faint static, some ghostly electrical interference. What he heard was breathing. Slow, regular breaths. In, out, in, out. It was unmistakably human, but it had a strange, filtered quality as if coming from a great distance or through some kind of barrier. "Hello," Miles said, his voice a shaky whisper. The breathing continued, unchanged. Who is this?" he asked, his voice gaining a little strength, though his heart was now hammering against his ribs. No response, just the rhythmic rise and fall of someone's, or something's, breath. He stood there for several minutes, listening, his mind racing. A prank? Some kind of elaborate, bizarre joke? But how? The phone wasn't connected to anything, couldn't be ringing, couldn't be transmitting sound. Finally, he slammed the receiver back down onto its cradle, the sound echoing through the basement. He backed away from the shelf, his eyes fixed on the phone, as if expecting it to suddenly spring to life, to sprout legs and chase him. He practically ran back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him and locking it, a futile gesture, he knew, but one that made him feel slightly less vulnerable. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office chair, staring at the closed basement door, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. his mind replaying the impossible sound of that ringing phone, that unsettling breathing. The next morning, he tried to convince himself it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the memory was too vivid, too real. He avoided the basement for the next few days, doing his laundry at a laundromat in town, telling himself he was just being practical, saving water and electricity. But he knew the real reason. He was afraid. By Friday, however, he couldn't avoid it any longer. He needed tools from the basement to fix a loose board on the porch. He forced himself to go down there, in the bright light of day, armed with a heavy wrench, more for reassurance than for actual use. The basement was exactly as he'd left it. Dust, cobwebs, the jumble of discarded furniture and boxes. And the phone, sitting innocently on its shelf, looking like nothing more than a dusty antique. He approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. He picked up the receiver, half expecting to hear that breathing again. Nothing. Silence. Not even a dial tone. He examined the phone more closely. The cord was definitely cut, severed about 6 inches from where it entered the base. There was no way it could be connected to any phone line. He was about to put the receiver back down when he noticed something. The dust on the shelf around the phone was disturbed. There were faint marks in it, like something had been dragged across the surface. He frowned, his unease growing. He hadn't noticed those marks before. He was sure of it. He left the basement quickly, locking the door behind him. He tried to focus on his work, on fixing the porch, on anything but the phone. But that night, at precisely 11:30 p.m., it rang again. Miles was in bed, reading, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of dread that had been building all evening. When the ringing started, it was fainter this time, muffled by the distance and the closed doors, but still unmistakable. He put down his book, his heart sinking. He knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to know what was going on. He got out of bed, his bare feet cold on the wooden floor. He walked slowly down the hallway, towards the stairs, the ringing growing louder with each step. He stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The sound was definitely coming from the basement. It was more insistent now, a frantic, almost desperate ringing. He descended the stairs, his hand gripping the railing tightly. The basement door was closed, as he'd left it. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The basement lights were off. The ringing echoed through the darkness, seeming to vibrate in the very air around him. He fumbled for the light switch, his fingers brushing against the cold, damp wall. He flipped the switch. The single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak, yellowish light over the scene. The phone sat on the shelf exactly as before, ringing. He approached it slowly, cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows, half expecting to see something. The ringing stopped the moment his hand touched the receiver. He lifted it to his ear. The breathing, it was back. Slow, steady, rhythmic. But this time there was something else. A faint, scratching sound like fingernails on wood. "Who are you?" Miles demanded, his voice stronger this time, fueled by a mixture of fear and anger. "What do you want?" The breathing continued, unchanged. The scratching grew slightly louder. Then a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. "Help!" Miles froze, his blood running cold. "Help? Who needs help?" The scratching intensified. The breathing became more labored, more desperate. "Me! Where are you? What's happening?" The scratching stopped. The breathing turned into a series of ragged gasps. Then silence. Absolute, utter silence. Miles held the receiver to his ear for a long time, listening, waiting. But the voice didn't return. The breathing didn't resume. There was nothing. He slowly lowered the receiver, his hand trembling. He noticed something then, something he hadn't seen before. The marks in the dust on the shelf, the ones he'd seen earlier that day, they were more defined now, deeper. They looked like claw marks, 3 parallel lines scratched into the dust and the wood beneath. He backed away from the shelf, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: he was in way over his head. He ran. Miles ran upstairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. He didn't bother turning off the light. He grabbed his phone and called the only person he could think of who might be able to help. His friend, Kevin, a self-proclaimed expert in all things paranormal. Kevin, surprisingly, answered on the third ring despite the late hour. Miles frantically explained what had been happening: the ringing phone, the breathing, the whisper, the marks in the dust. Kevin listened patiently, interrupting only occasionally to ask clarifying questions. When Miles finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Okay, Miles," Kevin said finally, his voice serious. "This sounds intense. You said the phone's cord is cut, right? Completely disconnected." "Yes, I checked it myself, multiple times." "And you're hearing breathing? And a voice?" "Yes, a whisper. It said, 'Help me to.' And the marks? You said they looked like claw marks?" "Yeah, 3 parallel lines, scratched into the dust. And the wood." Another silence. "Miles," Kevin said slowly, "I think you need to get out of that house. Now, don't wait until morning. Go now." "But where am I supposed to go?" "I don't care. A motel, a friend's place, anywhere. Just get out of there. And don't go back in the basement. Do you understand?" "But the phone. The phone is not your problem anymore, Miles. Something else is. Something not good. Get out." Miles didn't argue. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, and his laptop and ran out of the house, not even bothering to lock the front door. He drove to the nearest motel, a dingy, roadside establishment 20 miles away, and checked in under a fake name. He didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering TV screen, his mind replaying the events of the past few weeks. He kept seeing those marks in the dust, those claw marks. The next morning, he called Mr. Abernathy, the landlord. He told him he was breaking the lease, that he wouldn't be returning to the house. He didn't explain why. He just said he'd had a family emergency. Abernathy didn't seem surprised. He didn't even argue. He just said, in that same gruff, indifferent voice, "Suit yourself. Keep the deposit." Miles never went back to the house on Hemlock Lane. He left everything behind: his furniture, his clothes, his new life. He drove back to the city, to his old apartment, to his old life. But the phone followed him. Not the physical phone, the black Bakelite antique. That remained in the basement, he assumed. But the ringing. He'd hear it sometimes late at night, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The shrill, mechanical ring of an old rotary phone. And sometimes, when he was alone, he'd hear breathing. Slow, steady, rhythmic breathing. Just on the edge of hearing. He knew he couldn't escape it. Whatever he'd encountered in that house, it had attached itself to him. It was a part of him now. He started researching old rotary phones, trying to find some rational explanation, some way to understand what was happening. He learned about phantom rings, a phenomenon where people hear ringing phones even when none are present. But that didn't explain the breathing, the voice, the marks in the dust. He delved into the history of the house, searching for any record of past tragedies, unexplained deaths, anything that might shed light on his experience. He found nothing, just the mundane records of ordinary lives, lived and ended. He even considered contacting a paranormal investigator, but he always stopped himself. He was afraid of what they might find. He was afraid of confirming what he already knew, that he was being haunted, not by a ghost, but by something else. He's writing this now, months later, in a new apartment, in a new city. He still jumps at every unexpected sound, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind. He knows the phone will ring again. He doesn't know when or where, but he knows it will. And he knows that, eventually, he'll have to answer. Because whatever is on the other end, it's not going to give up. It's waiting, patiently, and it's calling for him. He still has the key to the house. Bus stop 47. Daniel Carter hated taking the bus. But after a particularly grueling double shift at the downtown warehouse, and with his ancient Ford Escort in the shop for repairs, he had little choice. It was either the 11:45 p.m. bus or a prohibitively expensive taxi ride. He chose the bus. The stop on 47th Street was deserted, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a flickering streetlight. The late October air was damp and chilly, a precursor to the coming winter. Daniel huddled deeper into his worn jacket, his breath forming white clouds in front of his face. He was exhausted, his muscles aching, his mind numb from hours of repetitive, back-breaking labor. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of some monstrous beast, Daniel was relieved. He climbed aboard, swiping his pass at the reader, the familiar beep a small comfort in the otherwise unsettling silence. The bus was empty, eerily so. Daniel made his way down the aisle, choosing a seat about halfway back, on the driver's side. He leaned his head against the cold glass of the window, his eyes closing briefly. He just needed to get home, to collapse into bed, to forget about the endless rows of boxes and the relentless demands of his supervisor. They'd gone maybe 3 or 4 stops, the bus lumbering through the deserted streets, when Daniel felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He opened his eyes, his heart rate increasing. He looked around the bus, his gaze sweeping across the empty seats. Nothing. He told himself it was just fatigue, his mind playing tricks on him. He was about to close his eyes again when he saw her, an elderly woman, sitting in the very last row of the bus, directly behind him. He hadn't seen her get on. He was sure he hadn't seen her get on. She was dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, a long, shapeless dress that seemed to absorb the dim light of the bus interior. Her gray hair was pulled back tight in a severe bun, accentuating the sharp angles of her face. But it was her eyes that unnerved him. She was staring directly at him. Not a casual glance, not a fleeting moment of eye contact, but a fixed, unwavering stare. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and seemed to reflect the faint light with an unnatural intensity. Daniel quickly looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through social media feeds, pretending to be engrossed in something, anything other than the unsettling presence behind him. But he could still feel her gaze. It was like a physical weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He started counting the stops until his own, a silent mantra to ward off the growing sense of dread. 6 more. 5 more. The bus seemed to be moving slower than usual, the streets outside unusually quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, just the darkened storefronts and the occasional flickering streetlight. For stops, 3 stops, he risked another glance back. The woman hadn't moved. She was still sitting in the same position, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her body rigid, almost unnatural. But her head had turned slightly, following his movement. Her eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, were still fixed on him. And now he noticed something else. Her eyes weren't just reflecting the light. They seemed to be glowing, a faint, internal luminescence, like embers burning in the darkness. 2 stops. Daniel's hands were shaking. He stood up, grabbing his backpack, and moved towards the front of the bus, as far away from the woman as he could get. He couldn't resist one last look. The back row was empty. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The bus hadn't stopped since he'd last looked back. There was no way she could have gotten off. He scanned every seat, his eyes darting frantically, desperately searching for some sign of her. Nothing. She was gone, vanished. The bus lurched to a stop at his corner. Daniel practically stumbled towards the exit, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see if the woman was somehow still there, watching him. The doors hissed closed behind him, and the bus pulled away, its red tail lights disappearing into the darkness. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He was alone. He started walking, his pace quickening with each step. His apartment building was still several blocks away, and the streets seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, more menacing. That's when he heard the footsteps. Behind him, soft, almost inaudible, but definitely there. The rhythmic tap, tap, tap of shoes on the pavement. He told himself it was just someone else, another late-night traveler, heading in the same direction. He shouldn't be so paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him, a cold knot in his stomach. He walked faster. The footsteps behind him sped up, too, maintaining the same distance. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Nothing, just the empty street, the dark storefronts, the pools of orange light cast by the streetlights. But the footsteps continued, and now he could hear something else. Breathing, a faint, raspy breathing, close behind him. He started to run. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning, his legs aching. He could hear the footsteps behind him, getting closer, faster, and the breathing. It was louder now, more labored, more inhuman. He reached the entrance to his apartment building, fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the right one into the lock. He dropped them, the metallic jangle echoing in the silence. He snatched them up, his fingers scrabbling at the cold metal. He finally got the door open, slamming it shut behind him, his back pressed against the cool glass. He looked out into the street, his heart pounding, his eyes scanning the darkness. Empty. He was safe. He was inside. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He was being ridiculous. He was just tired, stressed, letting his imagination run wild. He turned to head for the elevator, then stopped. He wouldn't risk getting trapped. He'd take the stairs. He started up the stairs, his legs heavy, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. He reached the second-floor landing, then the third. He was halfway to the fourth floor when he heard it again. The footsteps, behind him, on the stairs. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror. There, standing on the landing below him, was the old woman from the bus. She was just standing there, motionless, her dark dress blending into the shadows of the stairwell. Her gray hair pulled back tight, her face pale and gaunt in the dim light. And her eyes, those eyes, they were no longer just reflecting light. They were glowing, a deep, unsettling crimson, like burning coals. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even scream. He was trapped, caught between the terror behind him and the unknown dangers that might lie ahead. The woman slowly raised one hand, her fingers long and bony, almost skeletal. She pointed at him, her arm extending in a way that seemed unnatural, too long, too fluid. Then she spoke. Her voice was raspy, distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. It echoed in the stairwell, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Asterisk, you cannot escape. Asterisk. Daniel finally found his voice, a choked, strangled cry that escaped his lips. He turned and ran, scrambling up the remaining stairs, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. He reached his apartment door, fumbling with his keys again, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He got the door open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt, locking the chain, every security measure he could think of. He leaned against the door, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He listened, his ear pressed against the wood, straining to hear any sound from the hallway. Nothing. Silence. He slowly backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the apartment. He turned on every light, flooding the rooms with a harsh, artificial brightness. He checked every window, every closet, every possible hiding place. Empty. He was alone. He sank onto the couch, his legs giving way beneath him. He sat there, in the brightly lit living room, his heart still pounding, his mind racing. He tried to rationalize what had happened. A hallucination? A stress-induced breakdown? But he knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard. That woman, those eyes, that voice. He grabbed his phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but the screen was blank, dead. He charged it just before leaving work. It should have had plenty of battery life. He tried turning it on, pressing the power button repeatedly. Nothing. The phone was completely unresponsive. He felt a growing sense of isolation, of being cut off from the world, trapped in his own apartment with what? That's when he heard the scratching. It came from the living room window, a faint, scraping sound, like fingernails on glass. Daniel slowly turned his head, his eyes drawn to the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could see a shadow moving behind them. A tall, thin shadow, with elongated limbs and a head that was wrong. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. The curtains began to billow, as if something was pressing against them from the outside. Daniel knew. He knew what was out there. He backed away from the window, his eyes wide with terror. He stumbled towards the bedroom, his mind screaming at him to run, to hide, to do something. He reached the bedroom doorway, and that's when he heard the glass shatter. Daniel spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The living room window was a gaping hole, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something foul, like decay and old dust. Standing in the shattered window frame, silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights outside, was the old woman. But she wasn't just standing there. She was climbing in. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, her limbs bending at impossible angles, her body contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. She moved like a spider, scuttling through the broken glass, her long, claw-like fingers gripping the window frame. Her dress was torn and ragged, revealing glimpses of pale, gray flesh beneath. Her hair, once neatly pulled back, now hung loose around her face, a tangled mess of white and gray. And her eyes, those eyes, they burned with an unholy crimson light, fixed on Daniel with a predatory intensity. He backed away, stumbling into the bedroom, his mind screaming in terror. He had to get out, had to escape. But where could he go? He was trapped, for stories up, with that thing between him and the only exit. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically, searching for a weapon, a hiding place, anything. The closet. It was a small, walk-in closet, filled with clothes and storage boxes. Not much of a hiding place, but it was the only option he had. He scrambled into the closet, pulling the door shut behind him, plunging himself into darkness. He pressed his back against the wall, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear it moving around the apartment now. The thud of its footsteps on the floor, the scrape of its claws against the walls, the hiss of its ragged breathing. It was searching for him. He held his breath, listening, trying to track its movements. It was in the living room, now in the hallway, now outside the bedroom door. The scratching started again, this time on the closet door. Slow, deliberate scratches like fingernails dragging across the wood. Daniel closed his eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the sound, the image, the terror. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then a whisper, a voice, right outside the door, so close he could almost feel its breath on his face. Daniel. He knew his name. The doorknob rattled. The door creaked open, a sliver of light piercing the darkness. Daniel screamed, a raw, primal scream that echoed through the empty apartment. And then, nothing. The police found Daniel the next morning, huddled in the corner of his closet, catatonic, his eyes wide and staring, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even blink. They found the shattered window, the scratches on the closet door, the muddy footprints on the carpet, footprints that didn't match any human shoe. They found no sign of the old woman. Daniel was taken to a psychiatric hospital, where he remains to this day. He never speaks, never responds to any stimuli. He just sits there, staring blankly ahead, his eyes reflecting a horror that no one else can comprehend. The apartment building manager told the police that Daniel had complained about strange noises and feeling watched in the days leading up to his breakdown. He'd also reported seeing an elderly woman on the bus and on the street, a woman who seemed to disappear. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. They closed the case, attributing it to a psychotic break, a tragic but ultimately unexplainable event. But sometimes, late at night, the residents of the apartment building on 47th Street hear things. Footsteps on the stairs, scratching at the windows, faint, raspy breathing. And sometimes, when the 11:45 p.m. bus pulls up to the stop on 47th Street, passengers report seeing an old woman sitting in the very back row, staring straight ahead, her eyes glowing with an unnatural crimson light. They say she never gets off. She just sits there, watching, waiting for someone to take the seat in front of her, someone to make the mistake of looking back. The Montana haunting. Caleb Hayes craved tranquility. After a messy and emotionally draining divorce, the constant noise and relentless pressure of city life in Denver had become unbearable. He yearned for solitude, for wide-open spaces, for a place where he could breathe again. He found it, unexpectedly, in an online listing: remote Montana farmhouse, 10 acres, price to sell. The pictures showed a weathered, two-story farmhouse, nestled amidst a vast expanse of rolling hills and dense forests. It looked isolated, yes, but also peaceful. The price was remarkably low, a reflection of its remote location and the considerable work it needed. But Caleb, a freelance web developer who could work from anywhere with a reliable internet connection, saw potential. He saw an escape. He bought the property sight unseen, a decision his friends and family considered reckless, bordering on insane. But Caleb was determined. He packed his belongings into his trusty Jeep Cherokee, said goodbye to the city, and drove north, towards the vast, untamed wilderness of Montana. The farmhouse was even more dilapidated in person than the pictures had suggested. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the windows rattled in their frames. But the setting was breathtaking. 10 acres of rolling land, a mixture of open meadows and dense woods, with a view of the distant mountains that made his heart ache with a longing he couldn't quite name. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, had died peacefully in his sleep, according to the local realtor. His children, living out of state, had no interest in the property and wanted a quick sale. They'd left behind a house full of old furniture, dusty antiques, and the accumulated debris of a long life. Caleb spent the first few weeks settling in, cleaning out the clutter, making basic repairs, and exploring his new surroundings. He discovered a neglected vegetable garden out back, overgrown with weeds but still showing signs of its former glory. He started clearing it, tilling the soil, planting seeds, finding a strange solace in the physical labor. His nearest neighbor, an old-timer named Jedediah, lived 2 miles down a rutted dirt road. Jedediah, a man of few words and deep-set eyes, seemed to regard Caleb with a mixture of amusement and suspicion. "City folk don't usually last long out here," he'd said, his voice raspy from years of smoking unfiltered cigarettes. "Gets lonely, gets quiet." Caleb had just smiled and nodded, confident in his ability to adapt. He was looking for quiet. He craved lonely. The first 2 months were idyllic. Caleb worked on his laptop, redesigned websites for clients he'd never met, and spent his evenings on the porch, watching the spectacular sunsets paint the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Then the unsettling incidents began. Small things, first, things he could almost dismiss as his imagination, or the quirks of an old house in the wilderness. One morning, he found deep scratches on the wooden fence surrounding his vegetable garden. They were too large, too deep, to have been made by a deer or a raccoon. They ran in parallel sets, for distinct gouges, as if something with enormous claws had raked across the wood. A week later, he found the tracks. It had rained heavily the night before, turning the ground around the farmhouse into a muddy quagmire. As Caleb walked towards his garden that morning, he saw them pressed deep into the soft earth. Footprints, but not human footprints. They were enormous, far larger than any animal track he'd ever seen. Almost vaguely human-shaped, but distorted. The toes were too long, too splayed, each print measuring nearly 18 inches from heel to toe. And there were claw marks, deep indentations at the end of each toe, that suggested something far more predatory than a bear or a mountain lion. Caleb took pictures, his hands shaking slightly. He showed them to Jedediah later that day, when he drove down to the old man's ramshackle cabin to borrow a tool. Jedediah studied the photos for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling around his head like a shroud. "You been hearing things at night?" he asked finally, his voice low. Caleb hesitated. He'd been hearing things, yes. Strange, unsettling sounds that seemed to come from the woods surrounding his property. But he'd dismissed them as the normal noises of the wilderness. The wind in the trees, the calls of nocturnal animals. "Just the usual," he said, trying to sound casual. "Wind, owls, that sort of thing." Jedediah looked at him, his eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "There's usual," he said, "and then there's unusual. Some places, they hold on to things that don't belong." He handed the photos back to Caleb, his expression grim. "Lock your doors at night, son, and keep a loaded gun handy." He wouldn't say anything more. He just turned and walked back into his cabin, leaving Caleb standing there in the dust, the unsettling feeling growing stronger with each passing moment. Caleb took Jedediah's advice to heart. He bought a shotgun, a sturdy 12-gauge pump action, from a sporting goods store in the nearest town. He started carrying it with him whenever he went outside, even during the day. He installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the house, their harsh glare illuminating the yard at the slightest movement. But the tracks kept appearing, sometimes near the garden, sometimes closer to the house, sometimes right outside his bedroom window. And the sounds at night, they were getting closer, too. They weren't just the wind or the owls anymore. They were different, like a guttural, choking sound, a mixture of a growl and a moan that seemed to come from deep within the woods. It was a sound that made his skin crawl, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent his heart racing. He'd lie in bed, listening, the shotgun resting across his chest, his finger on the trigger. He started to feel like he was under siege, trapped in his own home, a prisoner of the growing darkness. He was losing weight. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot. His hands trembled constantly. Then, one night, 3 weeks after he'd found the first tracks, everything changed. Caleb was sitting on his porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, the shotgun resting across his lap. He'd been doing this every night for the past week, a silent, solitary vigil, watching the tree line, waiting. The moon was full, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The motion sensor lights kept flickering on and off, triggered by something. He couldn't see what, just shadows moving at the edge of his vision. The air was cold, unusually so for early autumn. He could see his breath forming white clouds in front of his face. He sipped from a thermos of lukewarm coffee, the caffeine doing little to combat his growing exhaustion. Then he heard it, a scream. It started as a high-pitched wail, almost human, but then it twisted, distorted, becoming something else entirely. Something guttural, animalistic, filled with a raw, primal terror that made Caleb's blood run cold. The sound came from the woods, from the direction of the large oak tree that stood at the edge of his property, about 50 yards from the porch. It was a landmark, a solitary sentinel that he'd often admired for its size and its gnarled, ancient beauty. Now it was the source of his terror. He slowly rose from his chair, his muscles tense, his heart pounding in his chest. He gripped the shotgun tightly, his finger resting on the trigger guard. He clicked on the powerful tactical flashlight he'd mounted to the barrel, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the oak tree. First, he saw nothing, just the thick trunk, the gnarled branches, the shadows cast by the moonlight. Then something moved. A figure stepped out from behind the tree. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in what looked like claws, sharp and curved, glinting in the flashlight beam. Its skin was a pale, grayish color, almost translucent, like the skin of a corpse. But it was the eyes that truly terrified him. They were large, round, and glowing with an unnatural, yellowish-green light. They reflected the flashlight beam like the eyes of a nocturnal predator, but with an intelligence, a malevolence, that sent shivers down Caleb's spine. The thing just stood there, staring at him, its head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying him. He could hear its breathing, a slow, raspy sound, like air being forced through a constricted passage. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, frozen in the beam of his flashlight, facing this monster. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by fear, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Then the thing opened its mouth. It didn't speak, not in any human language, but it made a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. And he saw its teeth, rows and rows of them, sharp and pointed, like the teeth of a shark. It wasn't a smile. It was a threat. Caleb's finger twitched on the trigger. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't even consciously decide to fire. It was pure instinct, a desperate act of self-preservation. The shotgun roared, the sound deafening in the stillness of the night. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, nearly knocking him off his feet. The thing jerked backward, as if struck by an invisible force. The buckshot, a wide-spreading pattern of lead pellets, ripped through the air, impacting against its chest. But it didn't fall. It made that screaming sound again, that unearthly wail that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it darted behind the oak tree, disappearing into the shadows. Caleb fired again, blindly, aiming at the tree trunk, the shots blasting chunks of bark and wood into the air. He fired a third time and then a fourth until the gun clicked empty. He stood there, panting, his ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart. He slowly lowered the shotgun, his arms trembling. He reloaded, his hands fumbling with the shells, his mind still reeling from what he'd just seen. He spent the rest of the night in his truck, the engine running, the headlights illuminating the oak tree, the shotgun resting across his lap. He didn't dare go back inside the house. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, he cautiously approached the tree. He found more of those enormous, clawed footprints, deeper now than before, as if the thing had been struggling to maintain its balance. He found dark stains on the bark of the oak tree where the buckshot had hit. But it wasn't blood. It was something else, something viscous, oily, that smelled of copper and decay. He tried to leave that morning. He packed his essential belongings, threw them into his Jeep, and turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. He checked under the hood, and his blood ran cold. Something had ripped apart the engine, tearing out wires, hoses, and vital components. The damage was extensive, deliberate, and clearly not the work of any animal. The metal was twisted and torn, as if by enormous claws. He was stranded. He tried calling for help, but his phone had no signal. He was completely isolated, cut off from the outside world, trapped with that thing. He knew it would come back. It was just a matter of time. That was 3 days ago. Caleb has barricaded himself inside the farmhouse, boarding up the windows, pushing furniture against the doors. He has 5 shells left for the shotgun. He rations his food and water, knowing it won't last long. He spends his days watching the tree line, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his ears straining for any sound. He knows it's out there, waiting, watching, learning. Each night comes closer. He hears its claws scraping against the walls of the house, testing the defenses, probing for weaknesses. He hears its guttural growls, its chilling, inhuman screams. The motion sensor lights flicker and die, plunging him into darkness. He knows it's disabling them one by one. He's writing this now by the light of a flickering candle, his hands trembling, his mind on the edge of breaking. He knows this might be his last entry. He can hear it now outside the window, scratching, breathing, waiting. He just hopes someone finds this someday. He hopes someone understands what happened here. He hopes someone stops it. The candle just went out. He can hear it inside the house. He should have never looked. The frozen heart of Delilah Blackwood. "Look, darling, isn't the snow exquisite tonight?" she murmured, her voice a melodic whisper that barely disturbed the stillness of the room. Theodore Ashworth remained stiff, unmoving, in the aged, ornately carved oak chair. He simply stared, his gaze fixed upon her with an expression that could only be described as perpetual, frozen terror. He offered no response, his silence a stark contrast to the gentle snowfall visible outside the window behind her. Theodore smiled faintly, a weak, almost imperceptible twitch of his lips. He found her catatonic demeanor oddly endearing. It was just one of the countless aspects of her that had, over these past weeks, become utterly irresistible. She continued to sit there, her gaze locked with his, her face framed by the falling snowflakes. He glanced up at the grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging with a slow, measured rhythm. 11:30 p.m. He smiled again, this time a little wider, and whispered to her, "Not much longer now, my sweet Seraphina." He rose from his own chair and moved towards the hearth, where a fire blazed merrily, casting flickering shadows across the small, cluttered den. He poured himself another mug of steaming hot chocolate, the rich aroma filling the air. He looked back towards the window, his gaze meeting hers once more, drawn to the fading, yet still captivating, azure of her eyes. "Why don't you have a mug, my love?" he offered, his voice soft, almost pleading. Still, only silence answered him. He grunted softly, a sound of amusement tinged with a hint of frustration. He closed the lid of the kettle, took another sip of his hot chocolate, and continued to watch her. God, he thought, she's breathtaking. Seraphina, the sole source of warmth in his otherwise frigid existence, sitting silent and serene in the old mahogany chair, draped in the white gown he'd first seen her in. He often mused that if he were a painter, he would create a masterpiece from this very scene, a work that would rival the greatest artists of history. If he were a writer, he would craft a tale of love and loss, of obsession and despair, more potent than the most melancholic verses of Edgar Allan Poe. As the snow continued its gentle descent outside, he felt the air in the den grow perceptibly colder, a subtle but undeniable shift. "Why don't you come sit with me by the fire?" he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. He began stoking the flames, coaxing them to burn brighter, pushing back the encroaching chill. Still, she remained motionless, a statue of ethereal beauty in front of the window. With a warm, almost paternal smile, he set down his mug and approached her. "Here," he said gently, as he began to push the chair from behind, guiding it towards the hearth. "Allow me." About 2 or 3 feet from the warmth of the fire, Seraphina slumped forward, her body collapsing limply from the chair. "Oh dear," he exclaimed, chuckling softly. He shivered again, feeling the unnatural cold intensify, permeating the very air around him. "Come now, Seraphina. There's no need to be upset. It'll all come together soon." He carefully lifted her, repositioning her upright in the chair, and continued to push it the remaining distance to the hearth. Now, isn't that much better, dear? She remained as silent as ever, but her face could convey both everything and nothing simultaneously. Her eyes, reflecting the flickering dance of the flames, illuminated her pale, distraught features, revealing the morbid details of her condition. Yet, even in this state, he felt hopelessly captivated by her. He checked the clock again before rummaging in his shirt pocket. 11:40 p.m. From his pocket, he produced a small, withered sprig of mistletoe. He sighed, the grim cloud of reality pressing down on him. He had come to both anticipate and dread this night, Christmas Eve. It wasn't quite time yet. Soon it would all be over, but not yet. Attempting to banish the encroaching anxiety, he stuffed the mistletoe back into his pocket and walked over to the table beside the window. He selected one of the unlabeled records from a stack and placed it on the phonograph, carefully positioning the needle on the third track. It was one of his favorite tunes, a melancholic waltz, though for reasons he couldn't fathom, he could never remember the name of the composition or its composer. "Would you care to dance, to pass the time, my love?" he once asked, his voice a trembling whisper. He walked over to the chair and took her soft, cold hand, gently guiding her to her feet. Now, standing before him, the cloud of anxiety tightened its grip, threatening to suffocate him. "You look exquisite, my dearest Serafina," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of adoration and dread. He could hear her voice, a distant echo in the recesses of his mind, sounding as if it were emanating from the peak of a distant, snow-capped mountain. "In life or in death, I will always possess your heart, Theodore, and my kiss will be the sole warmth of your body, your heart, and your very soul." Slowly, carefully, he began to shuffle around the room with her, her body limp and unresponsive in his arms. He tried, with a desperate futility, to keep her braced upright against his chest, but to no avail. Despite this, he continued to waltz with her, his gaze fixed on her face, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The longer he stared into those two stiff, oceanic-hued irises, the more those horrible, maddening memories resurfaced, memories of that first fateful night. The night he lost himself to the allure of his dearest Serafina. The night that marked the beginning of his own unraveling. He could see it now with agonizing clarity, playing out in every excruciating detail. Her cold, frozen eyes, the long walk down the icy road, the night sky, the gaslit lamps that sparsely punctuated the snow-covered ground with their dim, ethereal glow. It had been deathly cold that night, just over a month ago, and he was walking alone, returning from another evening of toiling at the local market. He'd made this very same walk countless times before, but this night was different. How could he have not known then? Something had shifted in an almost supernatural way, within his very being. It was late, very late, when he saw her for the first time. There, by the street lamp, she stood, shrouded in a dress as white as the freshly fallen snow. And oh, those eyes, those mesmerizing, baby blue eyes that instantly seized him, holding him captive in their spellbinding gaze. He felt a wave of tranquil warmth wash over him, a sensation so intense it was as if he were standing next to a bonfire. And then that first shy smile she gave him, a smile of fragile innocence and yet, somehow, of a cunning, knowing nature. He saw that she was attempting to hang something from the top of the lamp post. As he approached, he realized it was a sprig of mistletoe, the very same one he now held in his pocket. "Hello there," he greeted, his voice a nervous tremor. "Isn't it a tad early for these?" She responded with that same playfully sly grin and replied, "The heart doesn't lie, and my heart tells me that the time is just right." "The time for what?" he asked, too bewildered. She giggled, a soft, musical sound. The time for one's heart to be warmed by a lover's kiss. He wasn't quite sure what she meant, but he somehow felt she was right. He could see she was struggling to hang the mistletoe. "Here, may I?" She gave him that softly sweet smile and handed him the 3 sprig. He then hung it from the top of the gas-fueled street lamp. "There we are," he said, "hung where you and all others can see it." Her smile widened and she chuckled. "You know what they say," she whispered, her voice taking on a balmy, almost seductive tone. He looked at her, intrigued. "What's that?" "The mistletoe is deadly if you eat it," she purred. "But a kiss is even deadlier if you mean it." He laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound, before losing himself once again in her captivating eyes. He felt an extreme sense of warmth envelop him, as though he were standing next to a roaring fire. He even began to unfasten his heavy winter coat. Before he could do or say anything further, she placed a slim, delicate hand upon his chest. Instantly, a cascade of emotions flooded through him, a torrential downpour of sensation. Suddenly, all perception of the world around him vanished. He continued to lose himself in her eyes, those mesmerizing, light baby blue whirlpools. "What's your name?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. Nothing. He could only barely perceive the sound of her voice. "What is your name, sir?" Still transfixed by her stare, he stammered, Theodore." She smiled, continuing to caress his chest tenderly, her fingers now working their way up and around his neck. She looked up at the mistletoe, then back at him, her grin growing wider. "Will you kiss me, Theodore?" she cooed. "Kiss me 'neath the mistletoe." His body began to act before his mind could register the implications. Slowly, he began to lean down towards her, his eyelids feeling heavier and heavier with each passing inch. Finally, their lips met, and he felt as though he were locked in an angel's embrace. She would be the one to break the union, turning away to leave, offering no words of farewell except to say, "I'll be waiting for you, love." He stood frozen, still spellbound, utterly bewildered. Eventually, his stupor broke, and he found himself disoriented, unsure of where he was or what had transpired. Only one thing was certain. He was excruciatingly cold. Such would remain the case for the remainder of that evening. It was that night, curled beneath his comforter, that he would see her face again, hear her voice again, that ever so seductive sound. "Kiss me, Theodore. Kiss me 'neath the mistletoe." A feverish infatuation, mingled with a bone-chilling cold, robbed him utterly of sleep that night and well into the following morning. And this torment would continue for the rest of that week, until eventually he no longer saw her in his dreams. Her face and her voice faded, becoming little more than an obscure set of features and sounds he could never quite piece together. That was until the following Sunday evening, when he was once again returning home from the market, passing by that very same street lamp. And there she was, as if waiting for him, standing by the street lamp, mistletoe hanging from its top, shrouded in her same white gown, beckoning him to her with those captivating eyes. And there it was again, that overwhelming warmth, that sense of belonging, that had felt entirely absent since their first encounter. For reasons he could never articulate, he felt complete. "I knew you'd come," she said, bearing that same seductive smile from before. He froze, trapped once again in her hypnotic gaze. Absently, he began to trudge towards her. When he reached her, she once more unfastened his coat and began caressing his chest. He could only stand and watch her, his mind completely blank, a vessel emptied of all thought and will. "My God, Theodore, you're so cold," she murmured. Her voice, while still sultry and smooth, took on an almost motherly tone. Indeed, he felt like a child again, warmed by her preternatural touch. "Let me warm you with a kiss." Again, her hand slithered up from his chest and around his neck, and he instinctively lowered himself, once more surrendering to her embrace. And again, that overpowering heat flared within him. She would break away again, and again. He would be left alone by the street lamp, with only a fragmented recollection of what had transpired. That night, too, resulted in restless torment. Writhing in his bed, Theodore dreamt. He dreamt of snow, of the gas lamp, of her beautiful eyes, her beautiful face, of the mistletoe. The mistletoe, deadly if you eat it, deadlier if you mean it. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to find this woman, this elusive temptress. Throwing on his heaviest winter garments, he set out into the bitter cold night air. The year's snowfall had begun to fall earlier that afternoon, and had by then formed a thick white blanket upon the ground. Slowly, he staggered through the snow, until he came once more upon the street lamp. His legs could no longer support him, and he collapsed to his knees before it. The mistletoe hanging down seemed to mock him. His vision began to blur, and with each fleeting, labored breath, the winter air wreaked its havoc, slowly draining the life from him. First, he lost all sensation in nearly every part of his body. Next, he felt the ice slowly form over his eyes, shutting him off from the world, blinding him. Just before the vicious winter would claim him entirely, however, he began to see the vague outline of a figure gliding towards him. He couldn't distinguish any defining features, only the apparently human silhouette. The approaching figure almost seemed to blend with the surrounding snow, a phantom in white. Only the long, crimson hair, braided around the figure's neck, gave him a flicker of recognition. It was her, or was it? As the figure drew nearer, he began to notice more and more details that differentiated it from the woman he so desperately sought. This new woman, while strikingly similar in many of her features, possessed a much paler, almost desiccated complexion. Had he still possessed the feeling in his body, Theodore would have bolted, fleeing for his life, but he could only lie there, helpless, and wait for this gruesome specter to have its way with him. He could feel his heart thundering, quaking against his chest with every inch she gracefully floated across the snow. He desperately wanted to at least close his eyes, to spare himself the sight of whatever horror awaited him. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed, a prisoner of his own failing body. When she finally reached him, she froze, staring down at him with eyes that were only a faded, ghostly semblance of the baby blue gems that had so entranced him. The specter knelt down and placed its pale, bony index finger on his lips. To his astonishment, the specter's finger wasn't cold or frigid, as he would have expected from one who looked so gravely. Rather, he felt that familiar wave of heat begin to pervade him again. She then cupped his chin in her frail hands and leaned in to kiss him. Instantly, all feeling returned to his limbs. He stood up, watching as the specter turned to leave. "Wait!" he exclaimed. She stopped and turned her pale, dead face to him once more. Who are you?" She turned slowly, before rushing towards him with a startlingly fluid motion, too quick for him to perceive. She was upon him again, taking him firmly by the throat, and whispered into his ear, in an almost inaudibly soft whisper, "I am Delilah. I am the warmth of your heart, the blazing fire in your chest, that you can never again live without." With that, she released him, and he watched her vanish 5 into the distance, disappearing into the swirling snow before he could even blink. Just as before, he was left alone and bewildered, unable to remember what had just happened, or why he six had even come. The only thing he could remember were fragments of a face, the face of a breathtakingly beautiful woman, and the face of a ghastly corpse. Along with this, Theodore could hear a soft, rasping whisper swimming through his mind. The voice was, of course, utterly indeterminate, without any sort of identity or definition to its origin. "A kiss from my lips will now and always be what keeps 7 your heart warm and beating, lest it submit to a cold, bitter end." That night was when his dreams of her first became vivid and clear. He saw her again, standing 8 amidst the falling snow, giving him that same dubious smile, indicative of sinful desire. And looking upon this face, he fell helplessly into a trance, and slowly walked towards her. The snow began to flurry more intensely, and he could feel the chill begin to cripple him again. The temptress extended her hand and curled her finger, beckoning him closer. "Come, will you dance with me, Theodore?" His pace quickened, and his heart raced with both excitement and apprehension, until eventually, he broke into a sprint towards her. To him, she seemed so close and yet so far away. The further he sprinted, the more elusive she became. At last, he reached her and was promptly seized in her embrace. And, like he was now in his living room with her lifeless form, they waltzed about amidst the white expanse, his attention fixed on her radiant smile, augmented by those captivating baby blue irises. "Kiss me, Theodore," she cooed to him with that angelic voice. He closed his eyes and leaned into her with anticipation. Likewise, she yielded her lips to him, and he felt the intensity of the sun burst within him. Slowly, however, he watched in growing fear as her face slowly devolved into that familiarly haunting, necrotic visage that plagued his subconscious mind. Aghast, he shoved her away and attempted to flee. Something caught his feet, and he fell prostrate into the snow. She was once more upon him, leering down at him with those cold, dead eyes. She knelt down and reached her hand down to him, clutching something small and frail in her withering grasp. Shaking, he looked to see that it was a small sprig of mistletoe. "You're so cold, Theodore," she rasped, in a ghoulish hiss. "Come, warm your heart with my lips, love." "No, no, go away," he exclaimed, as he felt the crippling chill return once more, causing his blood to begin to freeze solid throughout his body. He slowly lost all sensation of touch, and his eyes started to freeze over again. Her lips opened once more, and she spoke, her voice a chilling rasp. "You can't deny me long, Theodore. Without me, your heart, your soul, will rot in a cold, icy bed." As darkness threatened to consume him, Arthur watched as the ghost, poising the mistletoe high above them, leaned forward to his right ear and whispered, "I'll be waiting, love." It was in that instant that he awoke, bolt upright with a frightened shriek. For a time, Arthur just sat there, gasping frantically, as though he were a fish one pulled from the water, struggling for breath. Eventually, he managed to regain his composure, yet he still felt wrong. It was more of an empty sensation, a void, like something vital had been ripped from within him. What, how, or why, however, were questions that continued to elude him. But whatever it was, it left him perpetually cold, a frigidity that seeped into his very bones. He spent the next 3.5 weeks in this state of constant internal cold. Regardless of how many layers of clothing he wore, or how close he huddled by the blazing hearth, he could not find warmth. He consumed only scalding broth and lightly prepared stews, accompanied by steaming cups of tea, coffee, or cocoa. In spite of all of this, he was always so deathly cold, inside and out. Eventually, on the Sunday before Christmas Eve, he ran out of these meager provisions and was forced to venture out against the wrath of the cold. He had very little money by then, having received word earlier that past weekend that he'd lost his job at the market due to his self-imposed seclusion. Still, he had to find some way to banish the bitter cold that was crippling him. It was as he was trudging through the snowbound streets of the market that, amidst the many folks too who had likewise gathered that evening, his eyes fell upon her. She was standing at the bakery stall, her luscious crimson, braided hair facing out towards him, cascading down her back. Instantly, a nauseating dread flooded through him. "You need me, Theodore." He could hear from deep within the pit of his subconscious. "You need my lips. I can feel it. Come, Theodore, come to the mistletoe. Come, hold me, and kiss me." "No, no more," he screamed, his voice echoing through the market square. Almost all eyes from the present congregation were now fixed upon him, frightened and bewildered, oblivious to the attention he had garnered. Arthur swiftly bolted towards the young woman in front of the bakery, the seductress, the witch. With startling strength and intensity, he seized her by the shoulders and proceeded to violently shake her. "What have you done to me?" he barked, his voice filled with a desperate rage. His eyes locked onto her terrified face. Her eyes were wide and afraid, welling to the brim with tears. Who are you?" she stammered. Though he could see the fear etched onto the young woman's face, he would not relent. "What do you want from me?" Devil! She screamed and struggled frantically to free herself, for no avail. Arthur was determined to end this madness that was robbing him of his body, his mind, and his very soul. It would end there and then, even if it meant his own death. Answer me, why have you plagued me like this? Let the lady go, demanded a nearby bystander, his voice gruff and commanding. A broad-shouldered man, attired in thick animal fur garments indicative of woodland residency, stepped forward. Despite his hysterical frenzy, Arthur recognized the man. It was Magnus Stone, the town's lumberjack. "She's a witch," Arthur exclaimed to the crowd, his voice desperate, as Magnus pried him away from the distressed woman and began dragging him out of the market square. "She's afflicted me with some form of curse. Please, you must believe me. She's trying to steal my soul." The crowd merely looked upon him with disgust and shame, though as he was being forcefully hauled away, he thought no. He swore. He saw the young woman's shocked face twist into one of sinister exultation. His own flailing against Magnus' restraint was feeble at best, not impeding the lumberjack's iron grip in the least. Finally, Arthur was cast face down into the snow. "Stay down if you know what's good for you," Magnus commanded, before turning and making his way back to the market square. Lying in the frigid snow, Arthur's mind was lost in a maelstrom of confusion, fear, and pure madness. Why is she doing this to me? What does she want? Why don't they believe me? Tried as he might, no answers came. Pushing him further to the edge of complete collapse was the intensifying cold, now more potent than ever. It wasn't long before he succumbed to the elements once more, unconsciousness claiming him. And the first image to assault his hollow dream was, of course, her, leering over him, jeering. "In life or in death, your heart will always be mine, Theodore." He desperately tried to banish her presence from his mind, but to no avail. Regardless of how he tried, he was met only with her pale, dead face. "No! Stay away!" She simply remained, curling a beckoning finger with one hand, the other holding the 6 withered mistletoe aloft. "Join me under the mistletoe."
Theodore, come.
Arthur's eyes went wide as he saw his own body turn to ice. All too soon, he was encased in a layer of frigid, unforgiving glacier. He could only watch in perpetual terror as the spectral woman approached him. "You can't elude me, Theodore," the specter teased, in its rasping whisper, poising her decayed index finger at his heart. "Without me, you will only crumble." With a light tap of her finger upon his chest, the ice splintered and began to crumble. Helpless, he could only watch, horrified, as he fell apart, his body reduced to nothing more than shards of glassy ice. Only his head remained whole, yet even still, he was forced to watch as the specter picked up his head and, holding that damning mistletoe high above, brought her faded, gray 9 lips to meet his. Arthur awoke again with a scream, frantically patting his body, finding that he was still whole, and the specter was nowhere to be found. Yet relief wouldn't find him, as he was still menaced by the bone-chilling cold. He could hardly move his limbs, and he was profusely trembling from hypothermia. He wanted to cry, both from the crippling madness and the bitter fear, but the air was so cruel, so unforgiving, that it froze the tears as they welled in his eyes. With every minuscule reserve of strength he could muster, Arthur found himself to his feet and began stiffly shambling towards his house. It was as he crossed onto that familiar road leading to his home that he saw her again, walking all alone. Instantly, he felt the urge, the overwhelming compulsion, to rush to her, to try again to force her to relieve him of whatever spell or curse she'd cast upon him. It was this frightful determination, and this alone, that seemed to fuel his stride. She didn't seem to notice him approaching. It was perfect, he thought. He could sneak 11 up on her, ambush her, and be on his way with none the wiser. He would be rid of this curse at last. Thoughts flooded his mind, an avalanche of violent fantasies, of how he could force her to release him from his torment. He was prepared to do the worst if it came to it. After all, she's all alone now. It would be so easy, wouldn't it? Just a quick snap of her fragile little neck, and it'll all be over. And that was all he cared 12 about, to finally be rid of this phantasmic witch and her damn accursed mistletoe. It wasn't long before he was upon her. "Witch, I have you now," he ejaculated venomously, when she turned to him, exposing those all too familiar baby blue eyes, now frozen in an expression of utter terror. He knew he had her, finally, at his mercy. He knew he would finally end this madness. She quickly tried to hurry into her home, 13 to shut out her pursuer, but she was too little, too late. Arthur caught the door as it was about to close on him and forced his way inside. When she tried to run to the back 14 of the house, he caught her and roughly threw her to the floor. He was then upon her again, his hands like pythons around her throat, forcing the air from her lungs, commanding her to undo her wicked sorcery. It was, in more than one way, invigorating. He felt as though he were a wolf and she a cornered sheep. The look of utter fear in her eyes fueled him. Now he would bend her to his 15 will. "Whatever you've done to me, witch, it ends now." I haven't," she choked out, but it was no use. Arthur's strangulation had, by then, rendered her speech impotent. Frantically, she 16 clawed like an animal at his face, trying to gouge out his eyes. Nevertheless, Arthur's wrath was little impeded by her wild flailing. Her arm brushed the nearby drawer, knocking something off. Even amidst his primal state, he was able to see that it was a small, frail 17 sprig of mistletoe. "Mistletoe," he barked, with a lunatic laughter, as he began forcing it down her throat. Asterisk, deadly if you eat it. Asterisk. Slowly, he watched the life leave her eyes. Yes, he knew 18 he had won. Now it'll all be over, just one quick snap. He rose up triumphantly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He had done it. It was over. It was all over. The witch was dead. He stopped suddenly. His exultation died, replaced by another feeling: panic. He looked down again at the woman's inert body, now with a growing, sickening dread. What have I done? He tried to shake her, desperately hoping that she might yet still exhibit signs of life. She did not, and Arthur now felt his head begin to spin. What was he to do? He'd killed her. He was now a murderer. The court would have him hanged, for sure. He'd be condemned as a cold-blooded monster. But no, that wasn't what happened. Was it? She was a witch. Wasn't he 19, she? Had she not wrought misery upon his life? What he did was for the good of his own soul, wasn't it? In a brief, devastating avalanche 20 of realization, he began to remember her eyes, those hypnotic irises so wide with fear. All at once, dregs of recrimination and despair caused him to huddle himself into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably. "Arthur, Arthur." He heard the voice only faintly, but enough to recognize it. No, that's not possible," he stammered. All too soon, then, did he feel that haunting cold infect his body once more. Crippled, once again, he listened in terror as the wraith's voice appeared to close in around him, with its ghastly, rasping hiss. "In life or in death, I have your heart. I will keep it warm with me. Even in hell, it will belong to me, and me alone, forever and always." Arthur's body was trembling more violently than ever before now. "No, you're dead." As if on cue, he saw the woman's body suddenly bolt upright. Her face was now the very same as that of the specter, with her vibrant blue eyes now forever faded in death. "Kiss 21 me, Theodore," she croaked, as she began crawling towards him with disjointed, unnatural movements. Arthur opened his mouth, yet not a sound was able to be uttered, only pitiful croaks of fright. Before he could react, she was upon him, pinning him to the wooden floor, leering over him. She then began to open her mouth and croak as she painfully regurgitated the mistletoe onto him, now black and withered. "Come, won't you kiss 22 me, love? Before he could react, her pale, dead hands roughly seized his face, and her cold lips forced their way to his. This time, the warm sensation from before was not present, only the frigid touch of death and decay. He struggled until finally, throwing her off of him, she was sent hurtling into the wall with a crash, and she was once again motionless, lifeless. He simply 23 lay on his back, too frightened to move, in spite of his spiking adrenaline, gasping frantically for breath. When he finally looked up, he was met with her dead face, forever chiseled in perpetual fright. Reflexively, he touched his own lips, finding that they still felt as they had before, cracked and chapped, as they were from exposure to the unforgiving cold. Still, he had felt her lips, hadn't he? Arthur clutched his head and howled, as he began 24 shoving his head into the wooden floor. Please! His mind screamed. Please, merciful Lord, make it end. Eventually, he could bring himself to pound the floor no more. And that was when he crawled like an animal, 25 to the woman's battered corpse. Why are you doing this to me? This time, there was no answer. She merely stared back at him with stiff, faded eyes. He began shaking her, crying out for an answer. It was when he was again met with only silence that his terrified sobbing devolved into a fit of hysterical laughter. He collapsed onto his back, the corpse held firmly against him, as the laughter soon escalated into wailing cackles, 26 of pure madness that echoed throughout the house. In a morbid way, it was hilarious to him. What began with a simple kiss had now delved into the black recesses of insanity. He was once a man respected by the people. He was a well-liked market clerk, adored by those he served. Now, he was a madman, a lunatic, and 27 worst of all, a murderer. He carried on in his demented cheer until his throat was shot and his breaths became labored. Slowly, he could feel the chill again. His mind, now gone, forever broken beyond all repair. He unfastened his shirt and trousers before climbing onto her, mounting the withering mistletoe above. If it was him she wanted, she would have him, all of him. It would be days before reality would finally break through his madness. He sat that night, the eve of Christmas, staring into her dead eyes. He knew he couldn't live on like this, a prisoner to the curse of his own madness, to Delilah. The chill's grasp tightened and crippled him again. That was when it came to him, 28, what he would have to do. He went into the basement of the house and retrieved a bucket of kerosene, meant for the lamps, and he set about all night, dousing every inch of the house with it. Every wall, every corner, in every room was drenched, leaving none to be spared. As he toiled feverishly, her words continued to cycle incessantly, and the supernatural chill amplified in its ferocity. You need my lips. I can feel it. Come, 29 Theodore. Come to the mistletoe. Despite this, he didn't stop until the breaking of the next sunrise, when he had finally completed his task. Tonight, he swore to himself, this will all end. Tonight, 12 loud chimes broke Arthur of his 30 mad reverie. It was time. Steadily, he placed Delilah back into her chair and silenced the phonograph. He now felt more deathly cold than ever before. Still, this didn't deter him. With the last of the kerosene, he doused himself and her before stringing the 31 withered mistletoe to the ceiling. He then stood her up once more, embracing her to him, before using the poker to cast out a burning log, setting the floors alight. All too quick did the flames 32 dance, consuming the floors and the walls around them. Even amidst the inferno, however, Arthur still felt none of its warmth. He knew only one thing would, and it would be for the last time. "Merry Christmas, Delilah," he said, as he held her in an eternal embrace and brought his lips to hers, even as the flames crept upon them, charring flesh and bone. He did not waver. 33, he would die with his heart in eternal warmth, for even in death, she would always be the sole warmth of his heart. The lighthouse keeper's return. Arthur Sterling, a history enthusiast and amateur photographer, had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was a certain melancholy beauty he felt in the remnants of the past, in the echoes of lives lived and lost. So when his friend, Ben, suggested a weekend trip to explore the old Greymark Lighthouse, Arthur readily agreed. The lighthouse, perched on a remote, rocky islet off the coast of Maine, had a reputation. Decommissioned in 1987, after a series of unexplained incidents and a final, tragic disappearance, it had stood empty ever since, battered by storms and slowly succumbing to the relentless forces of nature. Locals whispered stories of strange lights, phantom footsteps, and a lingering sense of dread that clung to the place like sea mist. Arthur, a pragmatic man of science, dismissed such tales as folklore. He was interested in the lighthouse's history, its architecture, the stories it could tell through its decaying structure. He wasn't looking for ghosts, he was looking for stories. They set out on a Saturday morning, driving north in Ben's battered SUV, the landscape growing increasingly rugged and wild as they approached the coast. They parked at the end of a long, winding dirt road, the last stretch accessible only on foot. The islet was connected to the mainland by a narrow, rocky causeway, submerged at high tide. Ben, ever the cautious one, had consulted tide charts. They had a 6-hour window before the path would be underwater again. The sky was overcast, a dull, gray expanse that mirrored the churning sea below. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a tall, imposing structure of weathered gray stone, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a skull. Creepy, right? Ben said, a nervous grin on his face. He was already filming, his GoPro capturing their approach. Arthur nodded, his own excitement tinged with a growing sense of unease. The place had an undeniable atmosphere, a weight of history and isolation that pressed down on him. The entrance to the lighthouse was a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. It was locked, but the wood around the lock was rotted and crumbling. Ben produced a crowbar from his backpack, and with a few well-placed blows, the door splintered open. They stepped inside. The ground floor was a single, circular room, its walls lined with shelves that once held supplies. Rusted tools, coils of rope, and broken lanterns lay scattered across the floor, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The air was cold and damp, with a faint, underlying smell of mildew and something else, something metallic like old blood. In the center of the room, a spiral staircase, made of cast iron, wound its way upwards, disappearing into the darkness above. Well, this is atmospheric, Ben said, his voice echoing in the silence. He shone his flashlight up the stairwell. Shall we? Arthur nodded, his heart beating a little faster. He followed Ben up the stairs, the metal steps ringing hollow under their feet. They climbed slowly, cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Each landing revealed a small, empty room, probably once used as living quarters or storage. The windows were boarded up, plunging the interior into a perpetual twilight. It was on the fifth landing that Arthur first felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He stopped, turning around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the empty stairwell below. Nothing. What's wrong? Ben asked, pausing a few steps ahead. I don't know, Arthur said, his voice hesitant. I just felt like someone was here.
Ben chinkled nervously.
It's just the wind, man. This place is full of drafts. But Arthur wasn't convinced. He'd felt that sensation before in other abandoned places. It was always the same. A sudden chill, a prickling of the skin, a feeling of being observed by something unseen. They continued climbing, the air growing colder, the metallic smell stronger. They reached the 7th landing, then the 8th. Then Arthur saw it, a flash of light from above, from the lantern room at the very top of the lighthouse. He stopped again, his heart pounding. Did you see that? See what? Ben asked, his voice echoing up the stairwell. A light, up there, in the lantern room. Ben shone his flashlight upwards, the beam illuminating the remaining flights of stairs. I don't see anything. Probably just a reflection, or... He didn't finish the sentence, because that's when they heard it. Footsteps, on the stairs above them. Clear, distinct footsteps on the metal steps. Someone was up there. Arthur and Ben froze, their flashlights trained upwards, their hearts hammering in their chests. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs towards them. "Hello!" Ben called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" No response, just the footsteps, getting closer, louder. They could see nothing in the darkness above. The stairwell curved, obscuring their view, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was coming down. Maybe it's another explorer," Ben said, his voice unconvincing. Or the caretaker? But Arthur knew it wasn't. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever was coming down those stairs wasn't human. He remembered the stories, the local legends about the Greymark Lighthouse, the unexplained disappearances, the strange lights, the phantom footsteps. He dismissed them as folklore, as the product of overactive imaginations. But now, the footsteps stopped, just above them on the next landing. Silence, a heavy, pregnant silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. Then, a voice, low, raspy, distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. It echoed through the stairwell, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Leave. Arthur felt a jolt of pure terror, a primal fear that bypassed all reason. He wanted to run, to flee back down the stairs, to escape this place, this presence. But his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed by dread. Ben, however, reacted differently. He took a step forward, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice braver than Arthur felt. "Show yourself." The voice responded, the same distorted rasp, but this time the words were different. "Go back." Then the footsteps resumed, but they weren't descending anymore. They were ascending, moving back up the stairs, towards the lantern room. Arthur and Ben stood there for several minutes, listening, their hearts still pounding. The footsteps faded, then stopped. The silence returned. What was that?" Ben whispered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. Arthur didn't answer. He didn't know. But he knew one thing. They had to get out of there. "Let's go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." They turned and started to descend the stairs, moving quickly but cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the way. They didn't speak, didn't look back. They just wanted to get out, to reach the ground floor, to escape the oppressive darkness and the unsettling presence that seemed to permeate the very stone of the lighthouse. They were halfway down when they heard it again. A different sound this time, a scraping, dragging sound coming from below. They stopped, their hearts sinking. Something was downstairs. Something was blocking their escape. Arthur and Ben exchanged a terrified glance. They were trapped. Something above them, something below them, and the only way out was through the narrow, winding staircase. "What do we do?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Arthur didn't answer. He didn't know. He was trying to think, to find some logical explanation, some way out of this impossible situation. But his mind was blank, filled with nothing but a primal, overwhelming fear. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, closer. It was definitely coming from the ground floor, from the main entrance room. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the stone floor. Then they heard another sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. It was a sound of pain, of suffering, of something inhuman. Arthur felt a cold hand grip his heart. He remembered the stories again, the local legends. One in particular stood out. The story of the lighthouse keeper, Elias Greymark, who had disappeared in 1987, the same year the lighthouse was decommissioned. They said Greymark had gone mad, driven insane by the isolation, by the constant wind and waves, by the darkness. They said he'd started seeing things, hearing things, claiming that the lighthouse was haunted by the spirits of drowned sailors. They said he'd eventually thrown himself from the lantern room. His body never recovered. But what if he hadn't jumped? What if something else had happened? What if something had taken him? The scraping sound stopped. The moaning continued, rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Then, footsteps. On the stairs below them. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. Something was coming up. Arthur and Ben backed away, their flashlights trained on the stairwell below. They could see nothing in the darkness, but they could hear it, getting closer, louder, with each agonizing step. We have to do something, Ben stammered, his voice shaking. We can't just wait here. Arthur knew he was right. They couldn't just stand there and let whatever it was reach them. But what could they do? They were unarmed, trapped, with nowhere to run. He looked around desperately, his eyes scanning the small landing where they stood. There was nothing, just the bare stone walls, the rusted metal railing, the narrow, winding staircase. Then he saw it, a small metal fire axe, hanging on the wall, its blade dulled with rust but still sharp enough to do some damage. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. He grabbed the axe, his hands trembling. The metal was cold, heavy, the weight of it both reassuring and terrifying. When it gets to the landing, he whispered to Ben, I'll try to hit it. You run. Get out of here. Call for help. Ben nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. The footsteps were getting closer now, just a few flights below. They could hear the things breathing, a ragged, rasping sound that made Arthur's skin crawl. Then it appeared, a figure, slowly emerging from the darkness of the stairwell. Tall, gaunt, its form shrouded in shadow. Arthur raised the axe. The figure stepped onto the landing, fully illuminated by Arthur and Ben's flashlights. It was horrifying. It was tall, yes, and gaunt, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, its torso elongated, its head strangely small and misshapen. Its skin was a sickly, grayish-green color, stretched taut over bone, like the skin of a corpse. But it was the face that truly terrified them. Where eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets, dark and hollow, yet somehow seeing. The nose was a flattened, skeletal structure, the nostrils wide and flaring. The mouth was a gaping, lipless gash, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, yellowed and stained. It wore the tattered remnants of a uniform, a dark blue uniform with brass buttons, the uniform of a lighthouse keeper. It was Elias Greymark, or rather what was left of him. The creature, for it could no longer be called human, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. It raised one arm, its hand a skeletal claw, his fingers tipped with long, curved nails. Arthur swung the axe. He swung with all his might, aiming for the creature's head, a desperate, instinctive act of self-preservation. The axe connected, with a sickening thud, striking the creature's shoulder. But instead of embedding itself in flesh and bone, the blade seemed to bounce off, as if hitting solid stone. The creature didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice. It just stood there, its empty eye sockets fixed on Arthur, its lipless mouth twisting into a grotesque parody of a smile. Then it lunged. It moved with a speed that defied its decaying appearance, its long limbs blurring, its claws reaching for Arthur. Ben screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound. He turned and fled, scrambling back up the stairs, towards the lantern room. Arthur dodged the creature's attack, barely avoiding its razor-sharp claws. He swung the axe again and again, but each blow glanced off the creature's unnatural flesh, doing no apparent damage. He was losing. He knew it. He was no match for this thing. He backed away, his heart pounding, his lungs burning, his eyes fixed on the creature. He stumbled, his heel catching on the edge of the landing. He lost his balance, falling backward, the axe slipping from his grasp. He landed hard on the stone floor, the air whooshing from his lungs. He looked up and saw the creature looming over him, its empty eye sockets burning with a cold, malevolent light. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. Then he heard a shout, Ben's voice from above. "Arthur, the light!" Arthur opened his eyes. He saw Ben, standing in the lantern room, silhouetted against the sudden, blinding glare of the lighthouse beacon. The beacon, it had somehow been reactivated. The creature recoiled, hissing, shielding its face with its skeletal hands. The light seemed to burn it to cause it actual pain. Arthur scrambled to his feet, grabbing the axe. He saw his chance. He charged forward, swinging the axe with all his remaining strength, aiming for the creature's legs. This time, the blade connected. It sank deep into the creature's flesh, severing bone and sinew. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, unearthly wail that echoed through the lighthouse. It stumbled, its leg giving way, and toppled backward, falling down the stairs, its body tumbling and crashing against the metal steps. Arthur didn't wait to see if it was dead. He ran. He ran up the stairs, past Ben, out of the lantern room, and onto the narrow exterior gallery that encircled the top of the lighthouse. The wind whipped around him, the cold air stinging his face, but he didn't care. He looked down at the rocky causeway below. The tide was coming in, the waves crashing against the rocks, the path already partially submerged. He had to get out, now. He climbed over the railing, his hands gripping the cold metal. He lowered himself down, his feet dangling in empty space. Then, he let go. He fell. He woke up on the beach, cold, wet, and bruised, but alive. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The lighthouse stood silhouetted against the dawn, its beacon still sweeping across the sea. He never saw Ben again. The police searched the lighthouse, but found no trace of him. They found the axe, covered in a strange, viscous substance that defied analysis. They found Arthur's footprints and signs of a struggle. They didn't believe his story, of course. They attributed it to trauma, to shock, to a desperate attempt to explain the disappearance of his friend. Arthur was eventually released, a broken man, haunted by nightmares and the unshakable feeling that he was being watched. He moved far away to a landlocked state where he could never see the ocean again. But sometimes, late at night, he'd hear the sound of waves crashing against rocks, the cry of seagulls, the distant moan of a foghorn. And sometimes, he'd see a light, a cold, blue light, sweeping across his bedroom wall. And he'd know that the lighthouse keeper was still out there, waiting, watching, and remembering. He knew he should have let his friend fall. The antique dealer's regret. Theodore Theo Vance, a recent transplant to the quiet town of Port Blossom, Maine, had a weakness for antique shops. He loved the musty smell, the jumbled chaos, the possibility of unearthing a hidden treasure amongst the forgotten relics of the past. So, when he stumbled upon Mortimer's Curios and Collectibles on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he couldn't resist venturing inside. The shop was dimly lit, crammed with dusty furniture, chipped porcelain dolls, and stacks of yellowed books. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and something faintly metallic, like tarnished silver. An elderly man, with a stooped posture and a magnifying glass perched on his nose, looked up from behind a cluttered counter. "Can I help you, young man?" he asked, his voice raspy with age. "Just browsing," Theo replied, his eyes scanning the crowded shelves. He wandered through the shop, his fingers tracing the worn edges of antique picture frames, the smooth curves of vintage pottery, the intricate carvings of forgotten trinkets. Then he saw it. In a dimly lit corner, tucked away behind a stack of chipped teacups, was a watch. It wasn't particularly flashy, not gold or studded with jewels. It was a simple, elegant timepiece, with a worn leather strap and a silver case that had acquired a soft, warm patina over time. Theo picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The watch face was classic. Roman numerals, delicate hands, and a small, rectangular window displaying the date. Felt substantial, solid, a piece of craftsmanship from a bygone era. He turned it over and saw the inscription, Tempus Omnia Revelat, 1952. Time reveals all. Ah, yes, the old man said, his voice startling Theo. A fine piece, Swiss-made, belonged to a local clockmaker, fellow named Abernathy, I believe, passed away a few years back. His family brought it in. How much? Theo asked, already knowing he wanted it. $75, the old man said, his eyes twinkling. A steal, if you ask me. Theo agreed. He paid for the watch, tucked it carefully into his pocket, and left the shop, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. He'd found his treasure. The first few days, the watch performed flawlessly, kept perfect time, its gentle ticking a comforting presence on his wrist. He admired its classic design, its understated elegance, its tangible connection to the past. Then, exactly 1 week after he bought it, the watch stopped. It was 2 a.m. Theo, a light sleeper, woke up suddenly, for no apparent reason. He glanced at his bedside clock, then at his wrist. The watch hands were frozen at precisely 2 o'clock. 00. He frowned, assuming the battery had died. But this was a mechanical watch, not a battery-operated one. He wound the crown, setting the time again, and went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened.
2 Uhr nachts.
The watch stopped. This time, Theo was awake. He'd been working late on a freelance project, and he happened to glance at his wrist at the exact moment the second hand froze. He felt a prickle of unease. It was a strange coincidence, certainly, but old watches were known for being temperamental. He wound it again, setting the time, and tried to dismiss it. The third night, he decided to stay up and watch. He sat in his living room, the watch resting on the coffee table in front of him, his eyes fixed on its face. As the minutes ticked by, he felt a growing sense of anticipation. He couldn't explain it. It was just a watch, an old watch, but something about its stillness, its silent waiting, filled him with a vague sense of dread. 1:58 a.m., 1:59 a.m., 2 a.m. The second hand stopped, and that's when he heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, not a crash or a bang or anything overtly alarming. It was a subtle sound, almost imperceptible. But in the stillness of his quiet apartment, it was unmistakable. The television, which had been off, flickered to life. Not to a channel, not to a program, but to static. A swirling, hissing snowstorm of white noise that filled the screen with a harsh, flickering light. Theo stared at the TV, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't touched the remote. He knew he'd turned it off before going to bed. He grabbed the remote, pressing the power button repeatedly. Nothing. The TV remained on, stubbornly displaying its static-filled screen. He stood up, his legs feeling strangely weak. He walked towards the TV, intending to unplug it, when he heard another sound. Footsteps. Above him. Theo lived in a single-story apartment. There was no upstairs. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, creaking across the ceiling as if someone were walking on old, wooden floorboards. He froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked up, his eyes scanning the ceiling, his mind desperately searching for a rational explanation. A neighbor? But his apartment was on the top floor. An animal? But the footsteps were too heavy, too regular to be an animal. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, directly above his head. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking. He dialed 911, but before he could hit the call button, he hesitated. What would he say? That his TV had turned itself on and he was hearing footsteps in a non-existent attic? They'd think he was crazy. The footsteps stopped. The static on the TV continued. A hissing, white noise that filled the room. Then a new sound. A dragging, scraping sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the ceiling. Theo backed away, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a growing sense of terror, a primal fear that he couldn't explain, couldn't control. He had to get out. He ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, his fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. He got the door open, stumbled out into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind him. He didn't stop running until he was outside, standing on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, the cold night air stinging his lungs. He looked up at his apartment window. The light was still on, and he could see the flickering glow of the TV screen through the curtains. His eyes fixed on his apartment building, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, he went back, cautiously, hesitantly. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The TV was off, the remote control on the coffee table. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything unusual, except the watch. It was still on the coffee table where he'd left it, but it was ticking again. And the date window, which had been displaying the correct date the day before, now showed a different date. October 31st, 1952. Theo stared at the watch, his mind reeling. October 31st, 1952. The date on the inscription. The year the watch was supposedly made. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Felt different, colder somehow, heavier. He tried to reset the date, but the crown wouldn't turn. It was stuck, frozen in place. He tried winding the watch, but the mechanism felt tight, resistant, as if something were blocking it. He decided to go back to the antique shop, to confront the old man, Mortimer, to demand some answers. He drove to the strip mall, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He parked in front of the shop, his eyes scanning the windows. But the shop was empty, not just closed, but empty. The windows were dark, the shelves bare, the Mortimer's curios and collectibles sign faded and peeling. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Theo got out of his car, his legs feeling weak. He tried the door, but it was locked. He peered through the grimy windows, his eyes straining to see into the darkness. Nothing, just empty space, dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the dirty glass. He felt a growing sense of disorientation, of unreality. Had he imagined the whole thing? Had he somehow dreamed up the antique shop, the old man, the watch? He pulled out his phone, intending to call someone, anyone, to try to make sense of what was happening. But the screen was blank, dead. He charged it fully just a few hours earlier. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration, a wave of anger and fear washing over him. He was trapped, caught in some kind of bizarre, inexplicable nightmare. He decided to do some research. He drove to the local library, hoping to find some information about the antique shop, about the clockmaker Abernathy, about anything that might shed light on this mystery. He spent hours poring over old city directories, newspaper archives, and historical records. He found no mention of Mortimer's curios and collectibles. No record of a clockmaker named Abernathy living in Port Blossom. It was as if they had never existed. But he had the watch. He still had it, tucked away in his pocket, a tangible piece of evidence that he wasn't going insane. He pulled it out, examining it again. The inscription, Tempus Omnia Revelat, time reveals all. The date, 1952. He felt a sudden urge, a compulsion, to wear the watch again. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to put it away, to get rid of it, to throw it into the ocean and never look back. But the urge was too strong. He slipped the watch onto his wrist, the leather strap feeling cold against his skin. The moment the buckle clicked shut, he felt it. A shift, a change in the air around him, a subtle, almost imperceptible distortion of reality. He looked at the watch face. The hands were moving, ticking steadily. But the date was still October 31st, 1952. And then he heard it again. The footsteps. Above him. He was in the library. He knew he was in the library, but he could hear the footsteps, clear as day, creaking across the ceiling, as if someone were walking on old, wooden floorboards. He looked up, his eyes scanning the ceiling, his heart pounding in his chest, and he saw it, a shadow, moving across the ceiling, following the sound of the footsteps. A tall, thin shadow that didn't belong there, Theo stared at the shadow, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. It was impossible. He was in a public library, in broad daylight, surrounded by people. There couldn't be a shadow moving across the ceiling like that. But there it was, undeniable, unmistakable. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, back and forth. The shadow followed, mimicking the movements, growing larger, darker, more defined. People around him started to notice. They looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Some pointed, whispering to each other. Others simply stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. The shadow began to change. It elongated, distorted, its edges blurring, as if it were struggling to maintain its form. It grew arms, legs, a head that was too small, too elongated, too wrong. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. The ceiling began to creak, to groan, as if under a tremendous weight. Panic erupted in the library. People screamed, scrambling for the exits, knocking over chairs and tables in their haste to escape. Theo couldn't move. He was frozen, transfixed by the shadow, by the impossible reality unfolding before his eyes. The shadow stopped moving. It hung there, suspended from the ceiling, a dark, menacing presence that seemed to drain the light from the room. Then it spoke, a voice not from the shadow itself, but from the watch, from the antique watch on his wrist. A voice that was raspy, distorted, filled with a chilling familiarity. Asterisk time reveals all. Asterisk. The watch face began to glow, a faint, bluish light emanating from the Roman numerals, from the hands, from the date window. The light grew brighter, stronger, until it was almost blinding. Theo cried out, shielding his eyes with his hand. He felt a searing pain in his wrist, as if the watch were burning into his flesh. He tried to pull it off, to tear it away, but it was stuck, fused to his skin, as if it had become a part of him. The light intensified, engulfing him, blinding him. He felt a sensation of falling, of spinning, of being pulled apart and put back together in a way that was fundamentally terrifyingly wrong. Then, darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing in a different place, a different time. The library was gone. He was in a workshop, a small, cluttered room filled with tools, clocks, and watch parts. Sunlight streamed through a dusty window, illuminating a workbench covered in intricate gears, springs, and tiny screws. A man was standing at the workbench, his back to Theo. He was tall and thin, wearing a long, dark coat. He was hunched over something, his hands moving with a precise, almost obsessive focus. Theo recognized the watch. It was on the workbench, disassembled, its inner workings exposed. The man turned around. His face was blank, featureless, like a mannequin or a doll. But his eyes were burning with that same cold, blue light that had emanated from the watch. Asterisk, you now. Asterisk, the man said, his voice that same raspy, distorted whisper. Asterisk, time is not what you think. Asterisk. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and skeletal. He gestured towards the watch, towards the disassembled parts. Asterisk, this is the key. Asterisk, he said. Asterisk, the key to everything. Asterisk.
Theo understood.
He understood everything. The watch, the antique shop, the footsteps, the shadow, the voice. It was all connected. A loop, a cycle, a trap. He was trapped in time, caught in a repeating nightmare, a prisoner of the watch, of the clockmaker, of himself. For he saw now his own reflection no longer staring back, but staring out. He was the clockmaker, and he was doomed to repeat this cycle, to build the watch, to send it out into the world, to lure another unsuspecting victim into his trap. Forever. He finally realized, looking down at the watch, his power was never in the device at all. It was in the wearer's mind.